Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I am glad you are here tonight. Pull up something comfortable if you can. Maybe a blanket, maybe a warm drink, maybe just a quiet corner where the day has finally stopped asking things from you. Tonight we are not going to a battlefield or a throne room or a marble hall where important men sign papers while someone paints them for history. We're going somewhere much more recent, much more ordinary, and in some ways much harder to look at. We're going to an American house in the late 2000s. Not a famous house, not a mansion with iron gates, not the kind of house that appears in a glossy magazine with fresh flowers on the kitchen counter and a dog sleeping by the stairs. Just a regular home, a split level in Ohio, a ranch house in Florida, a small place outside Phoenix where the garage door sticks in the heat. A modest house in California's Central Valley, with toys in the yard and a mailbox at the curb. The kind of home millions of people spent years believing they had finally earned, and then, in the space of a few months, or sometimes a few awful weeks, that home stopped being safe. That is what we're going to sit with tonight. How Americans survived after losing their homes in the 2008 crisis. Not how the banks survived. Not how the stock market recovered. Not how economists later drew charts and explained the curve of the collapse. Those stories matter, and we will need some of them to understand what happened. But the story tonight is closer to the ground. It is about the people who opened the mailbox and found a notice they did not know how to answer. It is about parents who tried to sound calm in front of their children while deciding which bills could be paid and which could not. It is about families moving into spare bedrooms, motels, church basements, cars, storage units, and the houses of relatives they had not planned to live with again. It is about people who had once measured their future in mortgage payments and school districts and backyard fences suddenly measuring it in nights, in gas money, in how long a borrowed couch would remain available. Before we go there, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in a house you grew up in, an apartment you worked hard to afford, a room you rent, a place that still feels temporary, or somewhere that finally feels like yours? What time is it where you are? Is the room dark? Is there a streetlight outside your window? Is someone asleep nearby? I ask because the story of losing a home is not really about walls and roofs. It is about the small private routines that grow inside them. The cup that sits on the same shelf every morning, the mark on the doorframe where a child's height was measured, the drawer where old batteries, take-out menus, scissors and forgotten keys collect for years. A home is partly a building, yes, but it is also a map of habits. It is where people know how far to reach in the dark for the light switch. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you like history told through ordinary people and the daily details most textbooks leave behind, it would mean a lot if you subscribed and gave the video a like. You do not have to do it right this second. Do it when something here makes you pause, or remember, or think about a house you once knew. And if you want to leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight, I genuinely enjoy reading those. Sometimes the comments under these stories feel like their own little map of quiet rooms across the world. Now let us go back, not very far in calendar years, but far enough that the ordinary objects of the time have already started to look a little different. The year is 2008. A phone still flips open in many hands. A family computer may sit in the corner of a room on a desk that also holds bills, school papers, a printer that jams, and a little pile of envelopes no one wants to open. Cable news runs in the background in airport terminals and diners. At the gas station, people complain about the price of filling a tank. In many suburbs, there are houses with fresh paint, new countertops, and lawns kept green by sprinklers. Real estate signs stand at the end of cul-de-sacs. Some say for sale. Some say bank owned. Some say price reduced in letters that seem to grow larger as the months pass. For years before the crash, Americans had been told, directly and indirectly, that home ownership was the safest road into the middle class. It was the reward for work, the proof of stability, the thing a family could point to and say, "This is ours." Politicians praised it. Banks sold it. Television commercials wrapped it in soft music. Real estate agents spoke of building wealth. Mortgage brokers spoke of opportunity. Neighbours spoke of rising prices as if houses were not only places to live, but engines that could carry everyone upward. In many parts of the country, the numbers seemed to confirm it. A house bought one year could be worth much more a few years later. People borrowed against that rising value to fix roofs, pay medical bills, buy cars, cover college costs, or simply stay afloat while wages failed to keep up with the life they were trying to maintain. Then the machinery underneath began to fail. This is where the story often becomes hard to follow because the language changes. Suddenly there are mortgage-backed securities, credit default swaps, adjustable rate loans, subprime borrowers, derivatives, tranches, and balance sheets. It can sound like something happening in a locked room far away from ordinary life. But for a family at the kitchen table, the crisis was not experienced as a financial instrument. It was experienced as a payment that changed. It was a job that disappeared. It was a house that could no longer be sold for enough to pay off the loan. It was a refinancing promise that vanished when lenders stopped answering the phone. It was a bank envelope arriving after dinner. In the early 2000s, many Americans took mortgages that looked manageable at first and became much harder later. Some were adjustable rate mortgages, where the early payment was lower for a few years and then reset upward. Some were loans given to people whose income had not been checked carefully enough, or whose ability to repay depended on housing prices continuing to rise. Some borrowers were careless, some were misled. Some understood the risk, many did not. Some signed papers in offices where the person across the desk spoke quickly and pointed to the place for initials. A lot of people believed what they were told because the whole country seemed to believe it with them. House prices would keep going up. If the payment became uncomfortable, the house could be refinanced. If refinancing failed, the house could be sold. There would always be a way out because there had always seemed to be a way out. Then home prices fell. That short sentence does not sound dramatic enough for what it meant. It meant a family who owed $200,000 might discover the house could only sell for $150,000. It meant a family trying to move for work could not leave without bringing money to the closing table. Money they did not have. It meant a payment that had been painful but possible became impossible just as overtime disappeared or a job was cut. It meant the house, which had been sold as security, became a trap. For many people, the first real sign was not a headline. It was a late fee, then another, then a phone call, then a letter, then the word foreclosure, printed in formal language that made panic sound administrative. I want to slow down here because this is where the human part begins. A foreclosure did not start with a moving truck. It started in silence. It started with people not telling their children everything. It started with a mother saying the bank was working on it. It started with a father sitting in the driveway a few minutes longer before coming inside. It started with unopened mail placed under other mail. It started with arguments held quietly in the kitchen after the children were supposed to be asleep. It started with a calculator, a pay stub, a checking account balance, and the strange disbelief that comes when ordinary math refuses to become possible. There is a particular kind of shame that attaches itself to losing a home in America, and it is important to name it because it shaped how people survived. A job loss can be blamed on a company. A storm can be blamed on weather. A medical emergency can be blamed on the body. But foreclosure, especially in the way people talked about it in 2008 and 2009, often landed on families as a personal failure. People asked what they had done wrong. They wondered whether neighbours knew. They avoided conversations at school pickup. They parked in the garage so no one would see them carrying boxes. In communities where many houses were emptying at once, everyone knew, and no one wanted to say too much. The crisis was national, but the humiliation was local. It was on your street. It was in your mailbox. It was in the look exchanged between adults who had heard the same rumour about another family 2 doors down. And yet, people survived. That is the part of the story that deserves attention. Not because survival was neat, or inspiring in a simple way, or because hardship automatically makes people noble. It does not. Some families were broken by it. Some marriages ended. Some children carried the stress for years. Some people never fully recovered financially. But survival still happened, day after day, in practical decisions so small that they rarely appear in official histories. People called relatives. They negotiated with lenders. They went to housing counsellors. They sold furniture, tools, second cars, wedding china, exercise machines, and children's outgrown clothes. They stood in line at unemployment offices. They accepted help from churches and food banks. They slept in rooms that were never meant to hold a whole family. They sent children to school from motel parking lots and asked them not to say too much. They learned which laundromats were open late. They learned which fast food places had bathrooms clean enough to use before work. They learned how to make a new address sound less temporary than it was. This is not ancient history. That matters. Some of the children who lived through this are adults now. Some of the parents are still working. Some of the houses involved are occupied by new families who may have no idea what happened in the rooms before they arrived. The 2008 crisis is recent enough that people remember the exact carpet in the house they lost, the way the empty room sounded after furniture had been carried out, the last night before the keys were turned over, the feeling of driving away and not knowing whether to look back. It is also old enough that the broader story has been smoothed into phrases: financial crisis, housing crash, Great Recession, foreclosure wave. Those phrases are useful, but they are too clean. They do not smell like cardboard boxes. They do not tell you what it is like to choose which family photographs to keep when there is not enough room in the car. The American home has always carried more weight than it probably should. From the earliest settlements to the homestead era, from post-war suburbs to the mortgage boom of the early 2000s, the house has been treated as a sign that a person has arrived somewhere solid. In the United States, renting has often been unfairly described as temporary, while owning has been described as adulthood, responsibility, achievement. That idea was powerful long before 2008. After World War II, federal policies, new highways, cheap land outside cities, and government-backed mortgages helped millions of families buy suburban homes. Those benefits were not distributed equally. Many black families, immigrant families, and poorer families were excluded or pushed toward worse loans and worse neighbourhoods by discrimination that was written into lending practices, zoning, and local custom. By the time the 2000s housing bubble grew, home ownership had become both a dream and a pressure. People did not only want a house, they were told a good life required one. So when the crash came, the loss was financial, but it was also emotional and social. People lost equity, but they also lost identity. The homeowner became the borrower in default. The family house became the property. The living room became collateral. The front door became part of a legal process. Language changed first, and then the locks changed after it. A person could live in a house for 12 years, paint the nursery, plant tomatoes, repair the porch, memorize the sound of the furnace, and still be told by a bank or a court that the house no longer belonged to them. That legal fact may have been clear on paper. It was not simple in the body. Think about the final weeks inside a home under foreclosure. The rooms are still familiar, the refrigerator still hums, the same neighbour's dog still barks at the same hour, mail still arrives, the children still know which cabinet holds the cereal. But everything is different because the future has entered the house ahead of schedule. Every object becomes a decision. Keep it, sell it, store it, give it away, leave it. A sofa that once anchored a family room becomes too large for the next place. A dining table that hosted birthdays and arguments and homework becomes something listed online for a stranger to bargain over. In a stable life, possessions accumulate quietly because no one is asking each item to justify itself. In a crisis, every object has to explain whether it deserves space. The country saw numbers, families saw piles. This is one of the reasons the story of survival after 2008 is not only about homelessness in the visible sense. Some people did sleep outside, some slept in shelters, some slept in cars or vans or campers parked behind stores and along streets where police were less likely to knock. But many more entered a less visible form of displacement. They doubled up with relatives, they moved into basements, they rented rooms, they stayed with friends for 3 weeks that became 3 months. They moved from owner to renter, from renter to guest, from guest to burden, or at least that is how many felt even when the people helping them were kind. The official word might be housing instability. The lived experience was trying not to take up too much space in a home that was not yours. For parents, the central task became making disruption look ordinary. Children still needed breakfast. They still needed clean clothes, permission slips, lunch money, rides, medicine, sleep. A parent who had lost a house did not get to stop being a parent long enough to collapse. So the routines were rebuilt wherever the family landed. A motel dresser became a pantry. A cooler became a refrigerator. A cousin's living room became a bedroom after 9 at night. A plastic bin became the place where school clothes stayed folded. A gym bag became a closet. People made systems because systems are how a family tells itself it has not disappeared. There were also people who stayed in their homes for months after default because the system itself was overwhelmed. Banks lost paperwork. Courts backed up. Loan servicers gave contradictory instructions. Some families were told to miss payments to qualify for help, then punished for missing them. Others mailed documents again and again, only to be told nothing had arrived. During the worst years, foreclosure was not always a clean legal march from missed payment to eviction. It was often a confusing, drawn-out limbo. That limbo could feel like mercy because it gave people time. It could also feel like torture because no one knew when the end would come. Families lived in houses they were losing, mowing lawns and paying utilities on places that no longer felt secure. They slept under roofs that were both shelter and evidence of failure. The house protected them and frightened them at the same time. I want to be careful tonight not to turn these families into symbols. They were not all the same. Some had bought more house than they could afford. Some had been trapped in predatory loans. Some had steady jobs until the recession took them. Some were already poor before the crisis and were pushed into deeper instability. Some were middle-class families stunned to discover how quickly middle-class life could vanish. Some were elderly people who had refinanced a paid-off house to cover medical expenses or help children. Some were single parents. Some were recent immigrants. Some were veterans. Some were people who had done nearly everything the way they were told to do it and still lost. History is rarely fair enough to give suffering one clean cause. What unites them is not innocence or blame. It is the practical fact of having to continue. That is what this story will follow. The continuation, the morning after the letter, the packing, the phone calls, the relatives, the temporary rooms, the church pantries, the school forms, the storage unit bills. The jobs taken below a person's previous wage. The efforts to keep children in the same school district because changing schools would be one more loss on top of all the others. The small humiliations, like giving a former address to someone because the new one is not stable enough to say out loud. The unexpected kindnesses too, because those existed. Neighbours who helped carry boxes, teachers who quietly sent food home, grandparents who opened rooms they did not have, friends who pretended not to notice how long someone had stayed, strangers in waiting rooms sharing advice because no one else seemed to know how the system worked. We often tell the history of economic crisis from the top down because the top leaves records. Banks leave reports, governments leave hearings, the Federal Reserve leaves statements, Congress leaves transcripts, markets leave graphs, ordinary families leave fewer documents. They leave changed credit scores, missing photographs, school transfers, old storage receipts, and memories that may not be written anywhere. They leave stories told years later in careful voices. They leave children who remember a period when adults whispered more than usual. They leave empty houses on streets where weeds grew high, and neighbours wondered who would be next. So tonight, as we begin, do not picture the crisis first as a line on a chart. Picture a porch light. Picture one of those late evenings when the house is still standing and still full of everything that makes it familiar, but the people inside know the decision may already have been made somewhere far away. The dishes are in the sink. The television is low. A stack of mail sits on the table. Someone has circled a phone number on a bank notice. Someone has written a list of relatives, possible places, possible plans. The children have been told only part of the truth because part of the truth is all they can carry. Outside, the neighbourhood looks normal enough. Garage doors closed, sprinklers ticking, a dog barking behind a fence. The American housing crisis did not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it arrived as paper, folded twice, with a deadline printed near the top. And that is where we need to stay for a while, at the kitchen table, with the envelope open, before the boxes, before the motel, before the spare room, before the long work of starting over. Because the first thing a family had to survive was not the moving truck. It was the moment they understood that home, the word they had trusted more than almost any other, had become uncertain. The envelope did not look important enough to change a life. That was one of the cruel things about it. It might have been white or pale yellow, or printed with the logo of a mortgage company the family had never visited in person. It might have arrived with the rest of the mail, folded between a grocery circular, a credit card offer, a school notice, and the electric bill. There was no sound attached to it. No knock at the door. No official standing on the porch at first. Just paper, ink, a return address, and a name typed through a plastic window. For many American families during the housing crisis, this was how the loss of home entered the room. Not as a moving truck, not as a bank changing the locks, not as a courthouse auction. It began as a document on the kitchen table, a notice of default, a notice of intent to accelerate, a demand letter, a warning that the loan was past due, that the missed payments had not disappeared just because the family had stopped talking about them, that the bank or mortgage servicer was now beginning the process of taking back the house. The language was formal, but the fear it created was physical. The letter might say the borrower had 30 days to cure the default. It might list the total amount due, including late fees, inspection fees, legal fees, and other charges that made the number feel larger every time someone read it. It might warn that failure to pay could result in foreclosure. It might include phone numbers for loss mitigation, instructions for requesting help, and paragraphs written in a style that seemed designed less to explain than to protect whoever had sent it. The words were legal words, but they landed in a domestic place. They landed beside coffee mugs, children's homework, a bowl of fruit, a stack of coupons, a set of keys, a grocery list, and all the ordinary evidence of a family still trying to live normally. This is an important thing to understand about the 2008 crisis. A foreclosure notice was not always a surprise in the simple sense. Most families knew they were behind. They knew the mortgage payment had not gone through. They knew the savings account was gone or nearly gone. They knew one credit card had been used to cover another. They knew a paycheck had been smaller, or a job had ended, or a business had slowed, or a medical bill had taken money that used to belong to the house. But knowing trouble is coming is not the same as seeing it printed on paper. A problem you talk around in whispers becomes different when the letter gives it a deadline. At that table, people read the same paragraph again and again, looking for a sentence that might mean something better than what it seemed to mean. They looked for a mistake. Maybe the amount was wrong. Maybe the bank had not counted a payment. Maybe the letter was automatic. Maybe calling tomorrow would fix it. That hope was common because the mortgage system itself had become confusing even before it became frightening. Many families did not send their payments to the same company that had originally made the loan. Loans had been sold, bundled, transferred, serviced, assigned, and sometimes transferred again. A homeowner might have signed papers at a local office with one lender, then mailed payments to another company, then received statements from a third. When trouble came, the person answering the phone was often not the person with authority to make a decision. The borrower spoke to a call centre. The call centre requested documents. The documents went somewhere else. A new letter arrived before anyone confirmed the old packet had been received. For a family trying to save a home, this was maddening in a very specific way. The crisis was huge, but the calls were individual. One borrower at a time, one account number, one set of forms, one person on hold, listening to recorded music, sitting at a kitchen table with a pen in hand and a folder full of tax returns, pay stubs, hardship letters, bank statements, and copies of bills. People learned new phrases: loan modification, forbearance, short sale, deed in lieu, principal reduction, reinstatement amount. They said these words to spouses and relatives as if learning the vocabulary might give them control over the situation. Sometimes it did help. Sometimes a family found a housing counsellor, got through to the right department, and negotiated a payment plan. Many did not. Many were told to send the same papers again. Many were told their file was under review while foreclosure continued in another office. Many were told somehow that they made too much money for one program and too little for another. The letter on the kitchen table was often the first visible sign that the family had entered a machine larger than themselves. There is a common mistake people make when looking back at this period. They imagine foreclosure as a quick event, as if a family missed a payment and soon after had to leave. Sometimes the process did move quickly, especially in states where foreclosure did not require a long court procedure. But in many cases it dragged on for months or even years. That delay created a strange emotional condition. Families were not secure, but they were not yet gone. They still slept in their bedrooms. They still cooked dinner. They still took out the trash. They still mowed the lawn, partly from habit, and partly because an unmowed lawn announced distress to the whole street. The house continued to function as home while the legal process slowly turned it into something else. The notice itself could be read in two ways. It was a warning, but it was also a calendar. It turned private fear into scheduled action. If payment was not made by this date, then another step would follow. If the default was not cured, the lender could accelerate the loan, meaning the entire remaining balance could become due at once. For most families, that phrase was almost absurd. They could not pay 1 month's mortgage. Now the letter described the possibility of owing the whole thing. The legal logic made sense on paper. In the kitchen, it felt like being told that because you could not lift a stone, you were now required to lift a mountain. For some families, the amount due was just barely out of reach, which made the situation even more painful. They were not always hopelessly lost at first. A few $1,000s might have caught them up. 2 months of payments, 3 months, late fees, attorney costs. People borrowed from parents, they sold cars, they cashed out small retirement accounts, they pawned jewellery, they took extra shifts, they called siblings with voices carefully arranged to sound practical instead of desperate. Some relatives helped, others could not. By 2008 and 2009, the crisis had spread so widely that the person you called for help might also be behind on a mortgage, worried about a job, or carrying debt they had not admitted to anyone. The family safety net existed, but it was full of holes because the recession had reached so many households at once. Inside the home, the letter created roles almost immediately. One adult often became the researcher, spending evenings online reading forums, government pages, advice columns, and warnings about scams. Another became the caller, the one willing to wait on hold and explain the situation repeatedly. Someone became the one who stayed quiet because the shame was too much. Someone became angry. Someone became practical. Someone started sorting papers into folders. Someone pretended the whole thing could still be solved with enough discipline. People do not respond to fear the same way, and the 2008 crisis put that difference inside marriages, parent-child relationships, and extended families under intense pressure. Children noticed, even when no one explained. They noticed the lower voices. They noticed when parents stopped buying certain groceries. They noticed when cable was cancelled. They noticed when a bedroom light stayed on late and one parent sat at the computer long after bedtime. They noticed words like bank and payment and lawyer without knowing exactly how those words connected to their own room. A child does not need a full explanation to feel instability. Children read adults the way adults read letters. They search faces for meaning. They listen at the edges of rooms. They understand that something has changed even when they are told everything is fine. Parents often try to protect them with partial truths. We are working something out with the bank. We might have to move. It is not your fault. We are going to be okay. Those sentences were necessary, but they were also difficult because the adult saying them did not always know if they were true. That was another burden of the crisis. Parents had to create emotional shelter before they had found physical shelter. They had to keep children steady while the ground under the family was still shifting. The letter also changed the relationship with neighbours. Before the notice, trouble could remain private. After it, privacy became harder to defend. In many communities, foreclosure filings were public. Notices could appear in local newspapers. Real estate websites began marking homes as distressed, bank-owned or pre-foreclosure. Eventually there might be papers taped to a door, inspections, real estate agents or strangers driving slowly past the house. But even before that, people sensed exposure. A family that had once waved casually across the yard might begin avoiding long conversations. They left early for work. They came home through the garage. They kept curtains closed. They did not want to answer innocent questions because innocent questions could corner them. How are things? Are you still thinking about refinancing? Did you see the house down the street went into foreclosure? Each question carried the risk of disclosure. The national conversation often made this worse. In the years after the crash, people argued about responsibility in blunt terms. Some blamed greedy banks. Some blamed careless borrowers. Some blamed government policy. Some blamed Wall Street. Some blamed people for buying houses they could not afford. There was truth and evasion in many of those arguments, but inside the kitchen none of them helped much. A family facing foreclosure was not an editorial. It was a collection of tired people trying to decide what to do by Friday. For many homeowners, the first major decision after the letter was whether to fight for the house or begin preparing to leave. That decision was rarely made all at once. People moved back and forth. One day the plan was to save it. The next day the math made that seem impossible. Then a phone call from the servicer offered hope. Then another letter contradicted it. Then a friend mentioned a government programme. Then the programme required documents the family had already sent twice. The uncertainty itself became a form of labour. Every day required emotional recalculation. Are we staying? Are we leaving? Are we telling the children? Are we calling a lawyer? Are we trying one more time? Are we done? The government did respond to the foreclosure crisis, but for many families the response felt distant, complicated, and slow. Programs were announced, acronyms entered the news. Officials spoke about stabilising the housing market, helping responsible homeowners, preventing avoidable foreclosures. On television, these announcements sounded orderly. On the ground, families still had to gather paperwork, prove hardship, call again, wait again, and hope the person on the other end understood the file. A policy can exist and still fail to reach a kitchen table in time. That gap between announcement and actual help was one of the defining frustrations of the period. There were also scams. That's another historical detail worth remembering because crises attract people who know how to sell hope. Families behind on payments received offers from companies promising to stop foreclosure, negotiate with lenders, or save the home for a fee. Some of these services were legitimate, many were not. A desperate homeowner might pay hundreds or thousands of dollars to someone who filed nothing, changed nothing, and disappeared. Others were encouraged to sign over deeds or enter arrangements they did not fully understand. When people ask why families did not simply make better choices, they sometimes forget that choices made under pressure are not made in a clean classroom with plenty of time and perfect information. They are made at night, after work, with a deadline approaching and a house at stake. There is a small domestic detail that appears again and again in stories from this period. The folder. Not a dramatic object, just a folder or a binder or a plastic file box. Families created them to hold the crisis in one place. Mortgage statements, bank letters, copies of fax confirmations, notes from phone calls with dates and names, pay stubs, tax returns, hardship letters explaining why the payment had become impossible. Those hardship letters were especially strange documents. Imagine having to summarise your private misfortune in a way that is honest, persuasive, and brief enough for an institution to process. Lost job, reduced hours, medical expenses, divorce, death in family, business failure, adjustable rate reset, too much debt, not enough income. Please consider us for assistance. Thank you for your time. A person could write a sentence like that while sitting in the very room they were trying not to lose. The hardship letter turned life into evidence. It asked people to make their pain legible to a system that measured hardship through forms. Too much emotion might sound unfocused. Too little might sound unserious. The right tone was humble, clear, and responsible. Borrowers learned to write this way because the house depended on it. They wrote about illness, layoffs, children, attempts to pay, desire to keep the home, willingness to cooperate. Then they signed their names and sent the letter into a process they could not see. Meanwhile, the ordinary life of the house continued. Laundry still piled up. The refrigerator still needed cleaning. Someone still had to take the car for an oil change, unless there was no money for it. Children still needed shoes. The lawn still grew. Pets still needed food. The cruel pressure of foreclosure was that it did not replace normal responsibilities. It sat on top of them. The family had to live through the emergency while still doing dishes. For some, faith communities became the first place they admitted the truth. A pastor, a priest, a rabbi, a church secretary, a women's group leader, a fellow parent from a school fundraiser. Religious institutions were not able to solve the housing crisis, but they often provided the kind of immediate help large systems could not. A grocery card, a utility payment, a referral to a counsellor, a listening ear, sometimes a place to stay later. In communities where unemployment and foreclosure hit hard, churches and local charities became informal crisis centres. They collected food, helped with rent deposits, connected people to shelters, and tried to preserve dignity in situations where the official process often stripped it away. Public libraries also played a quiet role. For people without reliable internet at home, or for those whose service had been shut off, libraries became places to search for jobs, print forms, apply for assistance, and read about foreclosure laws. In a period when so many services moved online, the library computer became a lifeline. A person could sit between someone doing homework and someone checking email while trying to save a house. That is part of the history too. Not dramatic enough for a movie scene perhaps, but real enough to matter. As the days passed after the first notice, the kitchen table often changed. It became less a place for meals and more a command centre. The family calendar might include payment deadlines, court dates, counselling appointments, and reminders to call the servicer again. Meals were pushed aside for paperwork. Children did homework next to foreclosure documents without knowing the full meaning of what was beside them. The table held two lives at once, the life the family was still trying to maintain and the life that was beginning to come apart. In some homes, denial lasted a long time. That is not a moral judgment. Denial is sometimes the mind's way of giving the body time to continue. People waited because waiting preserved the possibility that something might change. A new job might come through, a tax refund might help, a loan modification might be approved. A relative might offer money, the bank might delay, the market might improve. Hope can be practical, but it can also cost time. Families who waited too long sometimes found themselves packing in panic, with fewer options and more debt. Families who prepared too early sometimes lived for months in grief before they actually had to leave. There was no clean answer because the system did not give clean signals. For homeowners in judicial foreclosure states, there might be court papers, hearings, and more formal steps. In non-judicial states, the process could move through notices and sale dates without the same kind of courtroom involvement. Most people did not know these differences until they were already inside them. They learned that foreclosure law depended heavily on the state they lived in, that redemption periods varied, the timelines varied, that the same crisis looked different in Nevada, Florida, Ohio, Michigan, California, and Georgia. The national collapse came down through local law. That meant one family might have many months to remain while another had far less time. One person's advice, given sincerely, might be wrong for someone living across a state line. The letter was not only a warning from the bank, it was also an education, and the education came too late. People learned how little they had understood about the papers they signed at closing. They learned the difference between the lender and the servicer. They learned that a house could be worth less than the debt attached to it. They learned that a missed payment could become a cascade of fees. They learned that the word home did not appear in the process nearly as often as property, asset, collateral, borrower, obligation, and default. The language of finance removed the family from the centre of the story. It had to. That was how the system worked. But history should put them back there. Stay for a moment with one family at that table. The letter is open. The mother has read it twice. The father has taken off his work boots but has not moved them from the kitchen floor. One child is asking for help with math homework. Another is standing in the doorway because children know when they are being kept outside a conversation. The family dog is under the table, waiting for something to drop. The house itself is still warm. Nothing visible has changed. The same framed school photo hangs in the hallway. The same dent in the wall from a chair that hit it 2 years ago remains unpainted. The same magnets hold drawings to the refrigerator. If a neighbour looked through the window from across the street, they would see a family at home. But the people inside know the word home has shifted. Someone reaches for a pen. Someone circles the phone number. Someone says they will call in the morning. Someone else says they should call now, even though the office is closed, just to leave a message, just to do something. The first argument may begin there, not because either person is wrong, but because fear needs somewhere to go. It is easier to fight over whether to call tonight than to say aloud that the house may be lost. Later, after the children are in bed, the adults may read the letter again. The amount due is still the amount due. The deadline is still the deadline. The paper has not changed, but the room has. Once a foreclosure notice enters a home, the house is never exactly the same afterward. Even if the family saves it, even if the loan is modified, even if payments resume and years pass, that moment leaves a mark. It teaches the family that shelter can become conditional. It teaches them that a home can be questioned by a system outside the walls. It teaches them that stability, which once felt like a flaw, may have been more like a table balanced on legs no one had inspected closely enough. During the crisis, millions of American households learned that lesson in different rooms, at different tables, with different accents, incomes, hopes, mistakes, and histories. Some folded the letter and placed it carefully in a file. Some left it open because closing it felt dishonest. Some threw it across the room. Some prayed over it. Some photographed it. Some hid it from a spouse for a day or two because they could not bear to begin the conversation. Some called the bank immediately and entered the long maze of assistance. Some did nothing, because shock can look like inaction from the outside. But the letter was only the beginning of the physical work of losing a home. Before a family could leave, they had to decide what could come with them. That decision sounds simple until you picture the rooms. Closets full of winter coats and old toys, a garage with tools, paint cans, bicycles, holiday decorations, broken chairs that might still be fixed someday. A kitchen full of pans, mugs, school lunch containers, birthday candles, and the one roasting dish used every Thanksgiving. Bedrooms with mattresses, books, stuffed animals, dresser drawers, shoe boxes, medicine bottles, photographs, and clothes that still smelled like the house. Losing a home was not only a legal process, it was an inventory of a life under pressure. And once the notice had been read, once the phone calls had begun, once the possibility of rescue grew smaller, the next question became painfully practical. What do we take? What do we sell? What do we store? And what do we leave behind? The first box usually looked harmless. That is another detail people remember. A cardboard box from a grocery store, a liquor store, a workplace supply room, a neighbour's garage, or a stack bought from a moving company with money no one wanted to spend. It sat open on the floor while the family walked around it, as if it belonged to someone else. At first, there was often a delay. People did not begin packing the moment the foreclosure became likely because packing made the loss visible. As long as everything stayed where it had always been, the house still looked like home. The books were still on the shelves, the plates were still in the cabinet, the shoes were still near the door. A person could move through the rooms and pretend for a few minutes at a time that the legal process outside the walls had not reached the inside yet. Then one day, the box was filled. Maybe it started with the things that did not matter much: old magazines, extra towels, holiday decorations, clothes from the back of a closet. The objects easiest to pack first were the ones a family could place at a distance from daily life. Christmas lights in March, winter coats in summer, books no one was reading, board games missing pieces, a box labelled garage, another labelled closet. This early packing could feel almost normal, like preparing for an ordinary move. People told themselves that moving was something families did all the time. Americans moved for jobs, for schools, for marriages, for lower rent, for warmer weather, for a new start. The country has always had a restless habit of packing itself into wagons, trunks, trains, trailers, sedans, and rented trucks. But this was different because the destination was not always clear, and the move was not chosen in the ordinary way. The house was not being left behind because something better had been found. It was being emptied because remaining had become impossible. During the 2008 crisis, families facing foreclosure had to do something historians do not always see clearly in records. They had to reduce their lives quickly, not their emotions, not their memories, but the physical footprint of their household. A house can hold an astonishing amount of ordinary accumulation. The longer a family lives somewhere, the more objects become part of the background. Extension cords, old school projects, baby blankets, fishing rods, exercise weights, extra chairs, family photographs, half-used paint cans, paperwork from years before, duplicate kitchen tools, chargers for devices no one owns anymore. In a stable home, all of this gathers quietly. It fills drawers, closets, attics, basements, garages, sheds, and the high shelves no one looks at very often. Stability allows clutter to look harmless. A forced move turns clutter into a problem. The family had to ask a practical question over and over. Will this fit where we are going? That question was harder when there was no clear answer to where they were going. A family moving from a 3-bedroom house into a 1-bedroom apartment, or into a relative's spare room, or into a motel, or into a car for a short time they hoped would stay short, could not bring a household in the normal sense. A couch was too large. A dining table was too large. Children's beds might be too large. A refrigerator could not come. A washer and dryer might be sold, left or taken only if there was storage and money to move them. The objects that had once made the home comfortable became heavy, expensive, and in the way. This is where the crisis became physical. It entered the hands, the back, the knees, and the arms. Packing is labour even when a family is moving willingly. Under foreclosure, it became labour mixed with humiliation, urgency, and grief. People carried boxes through rooms while remembering when those rooms had been empty at the beginning, when they first arrived with hope instead of defeat. They removed pictures from walls and saw clean rectangles where frames had blocked sunlight for years. They found lost toys under beds, old receipts behind dressers, dust behind furniture, birthday cards in drawers. Every discovery slowed the work. A person would begin with the intention of filling a box and end up sitting on the floor holding a photograph from a vacation taken before the mortgage reset, before the layoff, before the late fees, before the word foreclosure entered the house. For parents, the children's rooms were often the hardest. Children do not own much in legal terms, but what they own matters intensely. Stuffed animals, cheap plastic trophies, school certificates, a collection of rocks, cars, dolls, trading cards, books, shoes, posters and clothes with favourite characters printed on them. Adults could understand square footage. Children understood the bed by the window, the place where the nightlight plugged in, the shelf where their things belonged. Asking a child to choose what to take was sometimes necessary, but it carried its own pain. Pick your favourites. We cannot take everything. We will get your other things later. Put what you really need in this bag. These sentences were spoken gently in many homes, but gentleness did not make them easy. Some parents packed children's rooms when the children were at school because watching them choose was too difficult. Others involved them because children who had already sensed the truth needed some control over something. A backpack could become the one stable object. Put your favourite things here. Keep this with you. In families living through housing loss, children often learn to distinguish between what was theirs and what could be lost. That is a hard education. It teaches caution. It teaches attachment and detachment at the same time. Some children became fiercely protective of small objects. Others stopped asking for things because they had learned things could disappear. The garage often revealed the gap between the life a family had planned and the life that was happening. American garages in the early 2000s were rarely just places for cars. They held the material evidence of intention. Tools for home repairs, lawn equipment, holiday bins, camping gear, sports equipment, paint for projects never finished, boxes from appliances, shelves full of screws, cleaners, oil, garden supplies and leftover tiles. The garage was where people stored not only objects but possible futures. A saw meant a deck might be built someday. A bicycle pump meant family rides might resume when things calmed down. A stack of storage bins meant there would be time to organise later. Foreclosure took that later away. Many families held yard sales, and these sales became one of the quiet public rituals of the crisis. To a passerby, a yard sale could look normal. Americans have always set things out on lawns and driveways, haggling over lamps and baby clothes in the morning sun, but in foreclosure neighbourhoods after 2008, some sales carried a different feeling. The prices were lower, the items were larger, the family looked tired. A neighbour might recognise furniture from inside the house, a dining set, a crib, a television, a tool chest, a treadmill, a grill. The sale was both practical and exposing. Every object placed outside told the street a little more than the family wanted to say. Selling things was rarely as profitable as people hoped. That was another hard lesson. A sofa that had cost $900 might bring $75. A child's bedroom set might bring a fraction of its price. Appliances, unless nearly new, sold slowly. China cabinets, formal dining sets, entertainment centres, and heavy furniture were difficult to move and unfashionable in smaller apartments. In the early days of online resale, Craigslist became a common place for families to list belongings, but selling through it required time, photographs, emails, phone calls, negotiations, and strangers coming to the house. The labour of selling possessions often paid far less than the emotional cost of parting with them. Still, cash mattered. $50 could buy gas, $20 could buy groceries, a few $100s from selling tools or a second car could cover a storage unit, a security deposit or a rental truck. Families learned to stop measuring an object by what it had meant and start measuring it by what it could do immediately. That was one of the most difficult shifts. The wedding gift became gas money. The exercise bike became a week of motel rent. The extra television became part of a utility deposit. A person could feel ashamed of selling things and relieved when they sold. Both feelings could exist at once. Storage units became an important part of this story. Across the country, self-storage had already been growing before the crisis, but for displaced families it served a very specific function. It allowed people to believe the move was temporary. A storage unit said, "We are not losing everything. We are keeping the pieces of our home until we can use them again." Boxes of dishes, beds, furniture, baby clothes, documents, family photos, tools and holiday decorations could be locked behind a roll-up door in a row of identical units near a highway. The monthly rent might be $80, $100, $150, depending on size and location. At first it seemed worth it. The family was buying time and preserving dignity. But storage could become another trap. A family without stable income might fall behind on storage fees just as they had fallen behind on the mortgage. If the bill went unpaid long enough, the unit could be auctioned. That meant a family could lose the house first, then lose the things they had saved from it. This second loss was often smaller in public terms but devastating in private ones. Furniture can be replaced eventually. Some items cannot. Baby photographs, a box of letters, military records, grandmother's quilt, a child's drawings, tax files, a hard drive with years of pictures. In the history of the housing crisis, foreclosure records show the loss of property, but storage auctions sometimes held the quieter loss of memory. Packing also involved documents. This is less emotional to imagine than toys or photographs, but it mattered greatly. Families had to gather birth certificates, social security cards, mortgage papers, tax returns, school records, medical records, insurance documents, bank statements, car titles, custody paperwork, and proof of income. A householding crisis can survive the loss of many objects more easily than the loss of documents. Without paperwork, it becomes harder to enroll children in school, apply for benefits, secure housing, prove identity, get a job, or negotiate with institutions. Some families created one box or folder that had to stay with them no matter what. It might sit in the front seat of the car during the move, separate from everything else. In a crisis, paperwork becomes a form of shelter. Pets created another painful decision. Many families had dogs, cats, birds, fish, rabbits, or other animals who were part of the household. When a family lost a house and moved into a rental, motel, shelter, or relative's home, animals could suddenly become impossible to keep. Some landlords refused pets. Some motels charged extra. Shelters often could not accept them. Relatives might be allergic, crowded, or unwilling. Animal shelters across hard-hit areas saw families surrender pets because housing had collapsed underneath them. The public story often focused on people, as it should, but for children especially, the loss of a pet could make the foreclosure feel final, in a way no legal notice had. The dog who always slept near the bedroom door could not come. The cat who sat in the kitchen window was given away. Parents sometimes described it as temporary, because they wanted it to be temporary. Often it was not. As the house emptied, sound changed. A furnished house absorbs noise. An emptying house echoes. Footsteps become louder. Voices travel farther. Children notice. Adults notice too, though they may not say it. The removal of furniture makes a home feel unfamiliar before the family has left it. The walls show scuffs. Carpet dents remain where beds and sofas stood. Curtains come down and rooms become brighter in an exposed way. Closets lose their density. Cabinets sound hollow. The house begins to resemble the day the family moved in, but without the excitement that once made emptiness feel promising. There was also the matter of what to leave. This was not always an act of carelessness. Sometimes there was no money, time, space, or help. Heavy furniture might be left because moving it cost more than it was worth. Old mattresses might be left because no one would buy them and there was no truck. Broken items, paint, chemicals, scrap wood, and household clutter might remain because the family had run out of energy. In neighbourhoods hit hard by foreclosure, empty houses sometimes held the remains of hurried departures. A child's drawing on the wall, a pantry item in a cabinet, a cracked mirror, a chair, a pile of hangers. People driving by saw neglect, but inside those rooms there was often evidence of exhaustion. Not every family was physically evicted. Some left before the final date because staying became too stressful. Some negotiated cash for keys, where a lender or servicer offered money if the occupants left the property in good condition by a certain deadline. This could be practical. A few $1,000s, or even a smaller amount, could help with a rental deposit or moving costs. But cash for keys also carried an emotional message. The family was being paid to leave quietly. In a crisis where dignity was already fragile, even useful money could feel strange in the hand. Friends and relatives often arrived to help, and their presence could be both comforting and embarrassing. Moving exposes a household. People see the inside of closets, the state of mattresses, the number of unpaid bills on the desk, the dust behind furniture, the old arguments stored in boxes. Help was needed, but help meant witnesses. A brother lifting a dresser might say nothing about the foreclosure, which was kind. A mother might fold linens with tight lips, wanting to help and wanting to ask how it got this bad. A friend might make jokes to keep the mood light, and the jokes might work for a few minutes. People who help during a forced move often remember the silence more than the words. The rented truck, when there was one, brought its own pressure. Rental companies charged by time and mileage. Every extra day cost money, every wrong turn cost fuel, every object had to justify its place. The largest items went in first. Mattresses, dressers, tables, boxes stacked around them, trash bags filled with clothes pushed into gaps. Families without a truck relied on pickup beds, minivans, borrowed trailers and repeated car trips. A whole household might be reduced into a sequence of drives: load, drive, unload, return, load, drive, unload, return. Moving became a rhythm of loss. For people going into a smaller apartment, the move had at least a destination. For those going into a relative's home, the destination required negotiation. Which room? How many boxes? Can the children sleep here? Where will the clothes go? How long is this for? No one wanted to ask that last question too directly because no one knew. A spare bedroom can hold guests. It may not be able to hold a displaced family's entire life. So many belongings remained in storage, in garages, in basements, or in cars. Families learned to separate daily life from stored life. Daily life became a bag, a drawer, a few outfits, school supplies, medicines, chargers, and toiletries. Stored life waited somewhere else. This separation changed people's sense of ownership. To own something but not have access to it is a strange condition. A child might ask for a toy and be told it was in storage. A parent might need a document and realise it was in a box under other boxes. Holiday decorations might remain locked away because retrieving them was too much work or because there was nowhere to put them. Some families paid to store dining tables they would not use again for years. Others eventually stopped paying because the storage bill had become impossible. At that point, the question returned in a harsher form. What is worth saving when saving it threatens the present? Food was packed differently. In a normal move, pantry items might go into boxes with kitchen supplies. In a crisis move, food could not be wasted, but it could not always be transported easily either. Frozen food might thaw. Open containers might spill. Families cooked odd meals in the final days to use what remained. Pasta with canned vegetables, frozen chicken, rice, soup from whatever cans were left. The last meals in a foreclosed home could be practical, strange, and quiet. People ate off paper plates because dishes were already packed, or they ate at a kitchen counter because the table had been sold. A house that once held holidays could end with everyone standing around eating what was left. Utilities mark the ending in another way. Electricity, gas, water, trash service, internet. Each had to be cancelled, transferred, or left unpaid. Losing utility service before leaving made the house feel abandoned while people were still inside it. No internet meant children could not easily do homework. No gas meant no hot water or cooking. No electricity meant the refrigerator became useless and evenings became difficult. Most families tried to keep basic utilities on as long as possible, but money did not always allow it. The modern American house depends on the invisible systems. When those systems shut off, the building quickly becomes less like home and more like shelter, and then less than shelter. Neighbours sometimes appeared during the packing. Some offered help, some pretended not to notice, some watched too closely. In hard-hit subdivisions, the sight of boxes and trucks could produce a fearful recognition. One family's departure hinted at another's future. Foreclosure could move through a neighbourhood like weather, touching one house, skipping another, then returning. Empty homes affected those who remained. Property values fell, lawns died, pools turned green, copper pipes were stolen from vacant houses, children lost friends, bus stops changed. A moving truck in the driveway was not only one family's story, it was a sign that the neighbourhood itself had been altered. Inside the family, packing could divide people by temperament. Some wanted to save everything because everything felt like proof the life had been real. Others wanted to get rid of as much as possible because objects had become burdens. One person might carefully wrap dishes in newspaper, while another said the dishes were not worth the space. One might keep old school papers, another might throw them out in frustration. These arguments were rarely only about objects. They were about hope, grief, guilt, and control. Keeping furniture meant believing there would be another home for it. Selling furniture meant accepting the present. Throwing something away could feel like surrender or relief, depending on who held it. For older homeowners, the packing could carry decades. Some people who lost homes after 2008 were not young families with starter houses. They were people who had lived in a place for 20 or 30 years, who refinanced during the boom, or borrowed against equity to help children, pay medical bills, or manage retirement. Their boxes held a longer record. Wedding albums, military papers, old tax files, china, family heirlooms, tools accumulated over a lifetime. The physical labour was harder on ageing bodies. The emotional labour was heavier because the house was not part of a beginning. It was supposed to be the settled place at the end. For renters caught in the foreclosure crisis, the packing could be even more confusing. Many tenants paid rent faithfully to landlords whose properties were foreclosed anyway. A family might receive notice that the house they rented had been sold or taken by the bank, even though they themselves had not missed payments. The crisis did not only remove owners, it displaced renters living inside properties tied to failed mortgages. Some had little warning, some had to prove their rights, some moved because fighting was too difficult. To these families, the cardboard boxes carried an extra injustice. They had done what the lease required, and still the home was lost. When the final day approached, the house became a checklist. Empty the cabinets, remove the food, take the curtains, patch holes or do not patch holes, sweep, leave keys, photograph rooms, read the meter, check the attic, check the shed, check under beds, one more look in every drawer. People often moved through the home in a pattern of disbelief. The mind keeps expecting another chance. Surely there is one more phone call, one more extension, one more document, one more way. But eventually the work becomes too concrete for denial. A mattress going through the front door makes the truth clear. A child's bed taken apart makes it clearer. The empty bedroom finishes the argument. The last objects packed were usually the ones needed until the end. Toothbrushes, medications, phone chargers, a few changes of clothes, important documents, snacks for the children, pet food if the pet was coming, cleaning supplies, pillows, blankets. The house narrowed down to what could fit in a car or the front of a truck. This narrowing is one of the most severe experiences of displacement. A family that once lived across multiple rooms suddenly lives out of containers. Bags become drawers, boxes become closets. The car becomes a hallway between old life and whatever comes next. Before leaving, some people walked through the rooms alone. They did not always tell anyone they were doing it. They stood in the doorway of a child's room. They looked at the kitchen. They checked the backyard. They touched a wall. Not dramatically, not like a scene written for film, but because the body wants contact with a place it is losing. A person might remember painting that wall, bringing home a baby, arguing in that room, watching snow through that window, setting up the first Christmas tree, grilling outside, fixing a leak, replacing a doorknob, falling asleep on the couch during a movie. None of these memories could stop the foreclosure. But they made the house more than the paperwork said it was. There were families who left angry. They slammed doors, stripped fixtures, damaged walls, or took appliances that were supposed to stay. There were families who left carefully, sweeping floors and locking up because they could not bear to leave the house badly. There were families too exhausted to do either. History should not make them all behave nobly. People under pressure do many things, some generous, some destructive, some understandable, only if you know how long they had been afraid. The act of closing the door for the last time was often quieter than people expected. No music, no speech, just a key, a lock, a hand on a knob, a last check to make sure no one had forgotten a bag. The family might still own the key for a little while, or they might leave it on a counter, hand it to a representative, drop it in an envelope, or keep it uselessly for years in a drawer. Keys are strange objects after a home is lost. They still look powerful, but they no longer open anything that belongs to you. Then came the drive away. For children, the view from the back seat mattered. Some watched the house until it disappeared. Some refused to look. Some asked when they were coming back. Parents answered in whatever way they could. Maybe soon. We are not sure. We will see. Not tonight. The car held the most necessary things and not enough of them. Behind it, in the house or storage unit or someone else's garage, remained the rest of a life that had been sorted under pressure. Ahead was the next problem, which was not emotional only but immediate and practical. Where do we sleep tonight? If there was a relative waiting, the family drove there. If there was a motel, they drove there. If there was no plan solid enough to name, they drove toward the first temporary shelter they could find. The boxes were packed, but survival had only changed shape. The work of leaving was finished enough for the door to close, but the work of living without that door was beginning. The next home might have a room number instead of an address, a couch instead of bedrooms, a parking space instead of a driveway, or a borrowed key that came with an unspoken deadline. The family had carried what it could. Now it had to learn how to sleep in a place that was not home and wake up the next morning as if a normal day could still be assembled from what remained. The first night away from the house did not always feel like homelessness. That is important to understand, because the word itself was frightening, and many families avoided it. They might say they were staying with relatives for a while. They might say they were between places. They might say they had a temporary arrangement, a short-term situation, a little setback, a rough patch, anything that kept the word from settling over them. A family who had owned a house only weeks earlier could find it almost impossible to describe themselves as homeless, even if all their belongings were in a storage unit, even if their mail had nowhere reliable to go, even if their children were sleeping under someone else's roof or in a motel bed paid for by the week. They had not become the image they carried in their minds of homelessness. They were not on a sidewalk with a shopping cart. They were not sleeping under an overpass. They still had a car, maybe a job, maybe a phone, maybe a debit card with a little money left, maybe relatives who could help for a few days. So they reached for softer words. But history has to be precise about this. Losing a stable home creates homelessness even when it does not look like the public version people are used to seeing. After the 2008 housing crisis, much of the displacement was hidden. It happened in spare bedrooms, converted garages, motel rooms, church basements, living rooms, campers, cars, and overcrowded apartments. It happened in places that did not appear in the daily count of people sleeping outside. It happened behind closed doors where families were trying hard to remain respectable, organised, and quiet. The country was full of people who did not have a home but were doing everything possible not to look homeless. The motel was one of the first places many families went because it solved the immediate problem. It had a door that locked, it had beds, it had a bathroom, it had heat or air conditioning, at least in theory. It did not require a credit history the way an apartment might. It did not always require a large deposit. It could be paid for one night at a time or 1 week at a time, which made it seem manageable to someone who could not see far ahead. A motel room was not a solution, but it was an answer to the question that mattered most after the boxes were packed. Where do we sleep tonight? In the years after the crash, extended stay motels and cheaper roadside motels became part of the survival map for many displaced families. These places were not designed to hold family life for long periods, but people made them do it. A room with 2 beds became a living room, bedroom, closet, pantry, office, and school preparation area. If there was a small refrigerator and microwave, the family had a kitchen of sorts. If there was no refrigerator, they used a cooler and bought ice. If there was no microwave, meals became sandwiches, fast food, canned items, or anything that could be eaten without cooking. A dresser drawer held socks and underwear. Plastic bags held laundry. The top of the television stand became a counter. The bathroom sink became the place to wash dishes, rinse baby bottles, soak stained clothes, shave, brush teeth, and sometimes cry quietly with the water running so no one else could hear. The cost of a motel could destroy a family's remaining money. That was the trap. A weekly rate might seem lower than rent because it did not require a lease or deposit, but over a month it often cost more than a modest apartment. Families paid for the flexibility because their credit was damaged, their income uncertain, or their rental applications rejected. A landlord could look at a foreclosure, poor credit, unemployment, or an eviction record and say no. A motel manager might ask fewer questions if the family had cash or a working card. So people paid more for less stability because the normal rental market had become difficult to enter. The rhythm of motel life was different from the rhythm of a house. There was no private yard. There was no bedroom door for children to close. There was no kitchen table where everyone could spread out. The parking lot was always near. Other people came and went at all hours. Doors opened onto exterior walkways. Ice machines rattled. Vending machines hummed, trucks idled. Arguments in the next room came through the wall. A child trying to sleep before school might hear footsteps outside the door and the low sound of a television from another room. Families learned the motel's noises the way they had once learned the noises of their own house, but these sounds did not comfort in the same way. They reminded everyone that the family was living in a place meant for passing through. Parents tried to create routines anyway. That was the work. Wake the children, fold the blankets, clear breakfast from the small table or the bed, make sure backpacks were packed, find clean clothes, hide the evidence of crowding before housekeeping came, if housekeeping came. Keep the room from looking too lived in, because looking too lived in could attract attention. Some motels had rules about how many people could stay in one room. Some charged extra. Some tolerated families as long as payment arrived. Some did not. The family had to manage not only money but visibility. Too much noise, too many bags, too many people, too much laundry hanging to dry, too many signs of a household forming inside a rented room could create problems. Children carried motel life into school in ways adults could not always control. They might be late because the motel was farther from the old bus route. They might not have a quiet place to do homework. They might smell faintly of the room, of fast food, smoke from other guests, cleaning products, or damp clothes that had not dried properly. They might be embarrassed to say where they lived. Some children invented addresses. Some gave the old address for as long as they could. Some were instructed by parents not to tell anyone because the family did not want child protective services involved, or did not want classmates to know, or did not want pity. Teachers sometimes noticed anyway. A student who suddenly had trouble concentrating, who stopped bringing signed forms, who wore the same clothes too often, who fell asleep in class, who guarded a backpack too closely, might be living through a crisis no one had officially reported. Federal law required schools to help children without stable housing remain enrolled and receive support, and many school districts had staff who worked quietly with displaced families. This mattered more than many people realise. School could be the one stable place left. The same teacher, the same hallway, the same lunch period, the same friends, the same desk. For a child sleeping in a motel, school was not only education, it was continuity. It was a place where the child did not have to think about where the family would sleep next week. Parents often fought hard to keep children in the same school after losing a house, even when transportation became difficult. A long drive each morning could be worth it if it spared the child one more loss. Then there was the couch. In many ways, the couch was more common than the motel and less visible. A sister's couch, a cousin's basement, a friend's living room, a grandparent's den, a co-worker's spare room. In official language, this was often called doubling up, but the phrase sounds too neat for what it felt like. Doubling up meant another household absorbing people, beds, bags, schedules, stress and need. It meant one family's crisis entering another family's routine. At first, it could feel like rescue. Someone opened the door, someone said, "Stay as long as you need." Someone cleared a shelf in the refrigerator. Someone found extra blankets. Someone made coffee the next morning and tried not to make the situation feel as serious as it was. Gratitude was real, but so was strain. A living room is not a bedroom. A couch is not privacy. A spare room may be spare only because no one is using it at the moment, not because it can comfortably hold a family for months. Every borrowed space came with rules, spoken and unspoken. What time could the children make noise? Who used the bathroom first in the morning? Could food be eaten in the living room? How much laundry was too much laundry? Was the guest expected to buy groceries, pay part of the utility bill, cook, clean, watch children, or stay invisible? None of these questions were cruel. They were the mechanics of crowded life. But answering them every day required patience that fear often reduced. People living on couches learned to shrink themselves. They kept bags packed because the room had to become public again in the morning. They folded blankets and stacked pillows. They tried not to leave toiletries in the bathroom. They apologised for normal needs. "Sorry, can I use the washer? Sorry, is it okay if the kids watch television? Sorry, do you mind if I make coffee? Sorry, we will be out of your way soon." That sentence, "we will be out of your way soon," was sometimes said for weeks after everyone knew soon had become uncertain. The host family also carried pressure. Many relatives and friends who took in displaced families were themselves financially stretched by the recession. They might be behind on their own bills, worried about layoffs, paying higher food costs, or living in small homes. Helping someone did not mean they had plenty. Sometimes the person offering a couch was only one missed paycheck away from needing one. That is part of what made the 2008 crisis so hard at the household level. It struck networks, not just individuals. When one family fell, the people who caught them were often already weakened. Crowding changed family relationships. Grandparents who had expected a quiet retirement found children and grandchildren moving in. Adult children returned to childhood bedrooms with spouses and babies. Siblings who had not lived together in years negotiated kitchens and bathrooms again. Old conflicts resurfaced under new pressure. A parent might feel judged by relatives. A relative might resent being depended on. Children might enjoy cousins at first and then grow tired of having nowhere to be alone. A marriage that had survived the foreclosure might struggle under the loss of privacy. There is a reason stable housing matters beyond shelter. It gives people room to recover from one another. For some families, the car became the last private space. Sometimes it was only for a night or two between arrangements, sometimes longer. Sleeping in a car after losing a home was not always immediate, and many people did everything they could to avoid it, especially with children. But when motel money ran out, when relatives could not take them, when shelters were full or separated men from families, when pets could not be brought inside, when pride or fear kept people from asking for more help. The car became a shelter with wheels and windows. A car offers protection and danger at the same time. It locks, it moves, it holds belongings, it provides a little heat if there is gas. It can be parked near bathrooms, lights, stores, schools or workplaces. But it is not built for sleep, and it is not legally welcome everywhere. Families had to think about where they could park without being noticed, ticketed, robbed, or forced to move. Big box store parking lots, hospital lots, rest areas, church lots, industrial streets, and quiet residential roads all had advantages and risks. Too dark felt unsafe. Too bright attracted attention. Too isolated was frightening. Too public invited questions. A person sleeping in a car becomes skilled at judging places. The night inside a car is governed by the body in a way a house usually protects you from. Seats do not flatten enough. Windows fog from breath. Cold gathers quickly. Heat becomes oppressive. Every position creates pain somewhere. A child can curl up in the back seat, but an adult wakes with stiff legs, a sore neck, and the feeling of never having fully slept. In winter, running the engine for heat uses gas, and can be dangerous if the exhaust is blocked or the car is poorly ventilated. In summer, leaving windows open invites insects, noise, and fear. People sleeping in cars often sleep lightly because the outside world is too close. A footstep near the door can wake everyone. Bathrooms become one of the central problems. In a house, a bathroom is so ordinary that people forget how much dignity depends on it. Without one, the day must be planned around access. Gas stations, fast food restaurants, grocery stores, libraries, parks, workplace bathrooms, school bathrooms for children. A parent sleeping in a car with children might wake them early to wash up in a public restroom before school, trying to make it feel like an adventure or a rushed morning rather than what it was. Teeth brushed at a sink beside strangers, hair combed under fluorescent lights, faces washed with paper towels, clothes changed in a stall or in the car under a blanket. These small acts were survival, but they were also exhausting because they required constant awareness of being seen. Food in a car became simple and often unhealthy, not because families did not know better, but because they lacked storage, cooking equipment, and money. Peanut butter, bread, crackers, canned food with pull tabs, bananas, fast food dollar menus, granola bars, bottled water, milk bought in small amounts because it would spoil, a cooler if there was room and money for ice. Parents who had once cooked in kitchens now fed children in parking lots, wiping hands with napkins saved from restaurants. The change could produce shame, especially in adults who had been raised to believe that feeding a family properly was one of the basic signs of competence. But competence requires tools. A person without a stove is not less competent. They are without a stove. Laundry was another repeated difficulty. Laundromats became places of maintenance and waiting. Clothes had to be washed because school, work, and public life still demanded cleanliness. But laundry required money, transportation, time, and somewhere to store clean items afterward. A family living from a car or motel could not let clothes spread out the way they might at home. Clean clothes went into bags, dirty clothes into other bags. If the bags mixed, the system failed. Small systems mattered. In unstable housing, order had to be portable. Some communities created safe parking programs, often through churches or non-profit groups, where people living in vehicles could park overnight with some protection and access to bathrooms or services. These programs existed because communities were forced to recognize that car dwelling was not only the experience of single men or isolated individuals, it included working people, older people, and families. Many people sleeping in vehicles during and after the crisis still had jobs. They drove to work from parking lots, changed in public bathrooms, kept phones charged where they could, and tried to maintain the appearance of ordinary stability. Employment did not always prevent homelessness. That was one of the facts the recession made harder to ignore. The cell phone became essential. It was the link to work, schools, banks, relatives, shelters, and possible landlords. Losing service could cut a family off from opportunity. People charged phones in libraries, cars, workplaces, fast food restaurants, and borrowed rooms. A phone held numbers, emails, photos of documents, directions, and the fragile possibility that someone might call with help. In earlier American crises, displaced families relied on letters, public offices, churches, and word of mouth. In 2008 and after, survival often required staying reachable. The phone was not a luxury. It was a lifeline with a monthly bill attached. Shelters were available in some places, but they were not simple answers. Family shelters could have waiting lists. Some shelters separated men from women and children, which meant a father might not be able to stay with his family. Some did not allow pets. Some had curfews that conflicted with work schedules. Some felt unsafe or unfamiliar to people who had never imagined needing them. There were families who avoided shelters because they feared being judged, reported, split apart, or treated as failures. Whether those fears were always accurate is less important than the fact that they shaped decisions. People do not choose shelter options from a list on a calm afternoon. They choose them under stress, with children watching, belongings in the car, and no guarantee that the next option will be better. For families staying in motels, couches, or cars, mail became a problem. A home address is one of the basic ways modern society recognizes a person. Job applications ask for it. Schools ask for it. Banks ask for it. Government programs ask for it. Medical offices ask for it. Without a stable address, people use relatives' homes, post office boxes, shelters, churches, or the old address as long as possible. But using someone else's address could create tension. Important letters might be lost. A check might arrive late. A school notice might go to the wrong place. Housing instability is not only about where the body sleeps. It disrupts the paper trail by which society keeps track of a life. There was also the matter of appearance. People working hard to survive often work just as hard to look as if nothing had happened. A parent might iron clothes in a motel room using a towel on a table. A teenager might style hair in a gas station bathroom before school. A worker might keep a uniform hanging from a car window hook. People kept up appearances not because they were vain, but because appearance protected them. It protected employment. It protected children from cruelty. It protected access to services. It protected dignity. In America, looking poor can make poverty more difficult. Looking homeless can make homelessness more dangerous. The emotional atmosphere of these temporary places varied. Motels could be tense, but they could also produce small routines. Children swam in the motel pool if there was one, and if the weather allowed, turning crisis into something that briefly looked like a trip. Families watched television together from beds because there was nowhere else to sit. Someone heated noodles in a microwave. Someone brought back takeout as a treat after a bad day. In a relative's house, cousins played. Grandparents helped with homework. A friend's couch might come with laughter in the evening and coffee in the morning. A car might be frightening, but it might also be the only place a family could speak freely. Survival is rarely one feeling. It contains fear, boredom, gratitude, anger, relief, embarrassment, and sometimes ordinary happiness in small amounts. Parents often hid the worst details from children, but children built their own explanations. Some thought the motel was temporary because of repairs to the house. Some knew the truth and pretended not to, because pretending helped the adults. Some felt responsible, especially if they had heard arguments about money spent on school supplies, clothes, medical care, or activities. Children are very good at placing blame on themselves when adults do not explain enough. The 2008 crisis left many children with memories that were practical rather than political. They remember the smell of the motel hallway, the taste of vending machine dinners, sleeping beside siblings in one bed, changing schools, losing pets, losing friends, and not wanting anyone to know. For adults, the loss of privacy could be one of the deeper shocks. In a house, even a small one, a person can close a bathroom door, sit alone in a bedroom, step into a garage, stand in a yard, or take a phone call away from others. In a motel room, every emotion happens near everyone. In a host house, private grief must be timed around other people's routines. In a car, privacy exists only when the windows are dark and no one is walking nearby. Couples had to argue quietly or not at all. Parents had to cry in showers, parking lots, or after everyone slept. The body had no place to release what the mind was carrying. This was also when many people discovered the difference between help and stability. Help could get a family through a night. Stability required something else. A motel voucher, a relative's couch, a tank of gas, a bag of groceries, a church gift card, a ride to an appointment. All of these mattered. They could be the difference between danger and safety. But they did not rebuild a home by themselves. To become stable again, families needed income, affordable rent, decent credit, or a landlord willing to overlook damaged credit, transportation, childcare, documentation, and time. After foreclosure, credit damage could follow a person into every rental application. The house was gone, but the record remained. There is a phrase people used often during the recession: starting over. It sounds clean. It suggests a blank page. For displaced families, starting over often began in crowded, uncomfortable, temporary spaces where nothing felt blank. Debt followed, grief followed, embarrassment followed, children's needs followed, old furniture sat in storage, the phone rang with collectors, applications asked about past addresses. Starting over was not a clean beginning. It was more like trying to assemble a workable life while carrying pieces of the broken one. And yet, families did assemble it, not all at once, and not always successfully the first time. They moved from motel to relative, from relative to apartment, from car to shelter, from shelter to transitional housing, from one doubled-up arrangement to another. They used tax refunds for deposits. They found landlords through friends. They rented basement rooms. They moved farther from the neighbourhoods where they had hoped to stay. They accepted smaller places, worse commutes, older buildings, and school changes. Some returned to home ownership years later, cautious and changed. Others never wanted a mortgage again. Many became renters by necessity, and then by preference, because owning had stopped feeling safe. The motel room, the couch, and the car were not only places of suffering. They were also evidence of how Americans survive when official systems fail to move quickly enough. Families became temporary engineers of their own lives. They turned coolers into refrigerators, bags into closets, relatives' rooms into shelters, library computers into offices, parking lots into bedrooms, and school routines into anchors. They lived in arrangements that were supposed to last a week and made them last long enough to reach the next week. This was not romantic. It was tiring. It was often humiliating. But it was work, and it deserves to be recognised as work. As weeks turned into months, one form of survival became more common than almost any other. Families moved in together. Not for a holiday, not for a visit, not for a cheerful reunion, but because the economics of separate households no longer worked. Parents moved in with adult children. Adult children moved back in with parents. Siblings combined rent. Grandparents took in grandchildren. Friends became roommates because friendship was cheaper than loneliness and cheaper than market rent. The single-family home, that great American symbol of independence, gave way in many places to crowded kitchens, shared bathrooms, mattresses on floors, and refrigerators labelled silently by who had bought what. It was not new in American history. Families had doubled up during the Great Depression, during wars, during migrations, during every period when wages, rent, and disaster pushed people back toward one another. After 2008, it happened again, quietly, one spare room at a time. Moving in with family sounded simple until people actually had to do it. That is one of the things the 2008 crisis made clear inside ordinary American homes. The phrase itself was easy to say. We're going to stay with my mother for a while. We're moving in with my sister until we get back on our feet. The kids and I will be at my cousin's place for a bit. It sounded temporary, practical, and almost old-fashioned, like something families had always done when life became hard. And in one sense, that was true. American households had expanded and contracted for generations. During the Great Depression, adult children returned home, grandparents shared rooms, boarders rented beds, and relatives combined income because separate households were too expensive to maintain. Immigrant families had long used crowded apartments as a way to survive low wages, save money, and help new arrivals. Farm families often held several generations under one roof because labour and care were organised around kin. The idea of everyone having their own private house, their own bathroom, their own bedrooms, and enough distance to avoid one another was not as old as people sometimes imagine. But by 2008, many Americans had been raised to believe that leaving home and staying gone was part of success. Adults were supposed to form their own households. Parents were supposed to retire into quiet homes. Children were supposed to have rooms of their own. A married couple was supposed to have a door they could close. The single-family house had become not only a building, but a statement. It said independence. It said privacy. It said we made it. When the crisis pushed families back under one roof, it did more than crowd the rooms. It challenged the story people had been telling themselves about what a successful life was supposed to look like. The first days in a relative's house could feel almost relieving. After the motel, the couch, the car, or the long uncertainty of staying put in a house that was being lost, a family member's home offered something that felt closer to real shelter. There was a kitchen with a stove. There was a refrigerator. There might be a washer and dryer. There were familiar faces. There was a bathroom that did not require a key from a front desk or a walk across a parking lot. Children might have cousins to play with. Adults might have someone to talk to after weeks of trying to handle everything alone. A grandmother might make a pot of coffee and say, "Sit down, you must be exhausted." A brother might help unload boxes without asking too many questions. For a little while, the house could feel like rescue. Then the routines began. A house designed for 4 people now held 7. A 2-bedroom apartment held a mother, her 2 children, her adult son, his wife, and their baby. A retired couple who had planned to use the spare bedroom for guests found it filled with plastic bins, a crib, school backpacks, and the tired adult child who had once left home with confidence. A basement became a bedroom. A dining room became a sleeping area. A garage became storage. A couch became someone's bed every night and had to become a couch again every morning. The house did not grow larger because the need had grown. People simply learned to fold themselves into it. Shared bathrooms became one of the first points of pressure. It sounds small until you imagine mornings. Adults getting ready for work, children getting ready for school, a teenager needing privacy, a grandfather with medication, a toddler needing help, someone brushing teeth while someone else waits in the hallway with a towel. Showers had to be timed. Hot water ran out. Towels multiplied. Toiletries crowded the sink. In a larger house, a second bathroom might help. In a small apartment, the bathroom schedule became an unspoken negotiation every day. No one wanted a family crisis to become a fight over toothpaste, but often that was exactly how larger grief came out. The house was full of people who had already lost control over something enormous. A bathroom delay at 7:15 in the morning could become the place where that loss of control finally spoke. The kitchen carried even more meaning. A kitchen is where a household reveals who is in charge. Before the crisis, the family that lost the house had its own cupboards, its own groceries, its own habits. They knew what brand of cereal the children liked, where the pans were kept, when dinner usually happened, where the dishes could soak overnight, and how much milk was enough for the week. In someone else's kitchen, every habit had to ask permission. Could they use the stove at this hour? Could they put their food on this shelf? Was that orange juice for everyone or just the host family? Who bought paper towels? Who finished the eggs? Who was expected to cook? Who was expected to clean? Some families handled this with kindness and planning. They divided shelves, shared grocery costs, made meal schedules, and treated the crowded house as a joint operation. Others struggled because the old family hierarchy returned immediately. A mother whose adult daughter moved back in might start treating her like a teenager again. The daughter, already ashamed of losing a house, might feel watched and corrected in every small action. A father might comment on spending. A sibling might resent feeding extra mouths. A son-in-law might feel like a guest in a home where his wife was once a child. The kitchen could become a place where help and judgment were difficult to separate. Money was rarely simple. A host might say, "Do not worry about paying us right now." That sounded generous, and it was. But food costs rose, utility bills rose, water use rose, gas and electricity rose. The washing machine ran more often, children opened the refrigerator more often, someone used more toilet paper, more laundry detergent, more shampoo. These are not grand historical forces, but they are where financial stress becomes daily life. Eventually someone had to mention money. Could you help with groceries? Can you cover the electric bill this month? Could you give us something toward rent? The displaced family might want desperately to contribute, but unemployment, reduced wages, damaged credit, and debt made even modest contributions difficult. Gratitude became tangled with embarrassment. The host family's generosity became tangled with its own bills. After 2008, many doubled-up homes operated on a quiet internal economy. One person paid part of the rent, another bought groceries, someone watched children after school, someone cooked for everyone, someone with a working car drove others to work. Someone who could not contribute money contributed labour. This was not always written down, and that was part of the difficulty. Families often resist making business arrangements with one another because business language feels cold inside love. But without clear expectations, resentment grows in the unspoken spaces. The person cooking every night might feel used. The person paying utilities might feel ignored. The person who had lost the home might feel they were being constantly measured and found insufficient. The house might still be loving, but love had to carry an unusual amount of bookkeeping. Children adjusted in practical ways before adults did. They learned where to sleep, where to keep their backpacks, which adults were strict, which cousins shared toys, which rooms were off limits, and where they could cry without being noticed. Some children found comfort in the crowded house. There were more people around, more meals with others, more chances to play, more adults to help. Others felt displaced all over again. All. A child who had lost a bedroom now shared with cousins or slept on a mattress on the floor. Bedtime depended on other people's television, other people's work schedules, other people's noise. Homework was done at crowded tables or on beds. A child might keep important possessions in a backpack because no surface truly belonged to them. For teenagers, the loss of privacy could be especially painful. Teenagers live partly through closed doors. They need space to separate from family, to talk to friends, to listen to music, to be moody without an audience. In doubled-up households, that space shrank or disappeared. A teenager who had once had a bedroom might now sleep in a living room where adults pass through late at night and early in the morning. They might feel embarrassed to invite friends over. They might hide the family situation from classmates. They might become angry, withdrawn, or unusually responsible. Some took jobs after school to help. Some cared for younger siblings while adults worked extra hours. Some quietly stopped asking for things. Housing lost aged children in uneven ways. The older generation carried its own complicated emotions. Many grandparents were glad to help. They loved their children and grandchildren. They saw the crisis and understood that blame was not simple. Some had lived through earlier hardships and believed family was exactly where a person should turn. but taking in a family could upend retirement. It could drain savings. It could bring noise, conflict, and physical work into a home that had become quiet. Grandparents who had expected to help occasionally became daily caregivers again. They cooked, drove children to school, covered expenses, and mediated arguments. Some did this with tenderness. Some did it with fatigue. Most did both. There was a reversal that many adults found difficult to accept. A person who had been a homeowner, a parent, a worker, a bill payer, someone with their own address and routines, could suddenly feel like a dependent child again. Moving back into a parent's house after foreclosure could reopen old wounds. The parent might remember the adult child's teenage irresponsibility. The adult child might remember being criticised, controlled, or misunderstood. The foreclosure did not create these histories, but it brought them back into the same hallway. Old patterns returned because the house remembered them, even if the people had changed. Couples also face strain in these crowded arrangements. A marriage needs more than affection. It needs space for conversation, disagreement, intimacy, and ordinary privacy. In a relative's home, a couple might have to talk in whispers after children slept, in a parked car, during a walk around the block, or through text messages while sitting in the same crowded room. Arguments about money, jobs, blame, and next steps became harder to manage because someone else might hear. Some couples became a team under pressure. Others turned on each other. The crisis exposed fault lines. If one partner had chosen the mortgage, trusted the broker, lost the job, hidden bills, or insisted on staying too long, resentment could settle into the room like damp air. Even when no one assigned blame, gender roles often reappeared under stress. Women frequently managed the children, school communication, meals, laundry, paperwork, and the emotional tone of the household. Men, especially those who had been raised to see providing as central to identity, often carried a particular shame around moving a family into someone else's home. A man who had once fixed his own fence and paid his own mortgage might now sleep under his father-in-law's roof and avoid the kitchen because he felt judged. A woman who had worked hard to make the lost house feel like a home might now cook in another woman's kitchen and feel the loss every time she opened a cabinet that was not hers. These reactions were not universal, but they were common enough to matter. The crowded house also changed daily discipline. Whose rules applied to the children? The parents who had moved in, the grandparents who owned or rented the house, the aunt whose children shared the room. A child might be allowed to eat on the couch at home but not here. A teenager might have had a later bedtime before but now had to follow the household's rhythm. If adults disagreed, children noticed and sometimes used the gaps. More often, they simply felt the tension. In a stable home, family rules grow over time. In a doubled-up home, rules have to be negotiated after the damage has already happened. There were practical benefits too, and history should not ignore them. Shared housing helped many families avoid shelters and cars. It allowed parents to save for deposits. It allowed children to remain in school districts. It allowed older relatives to receive help with errands, housework, or caregiving. It allowed food to be stretched through shared meals. It allowed job seekers to leave children with trusted adults while they went to interviews. It preserved families in a period when the formal housing market had become unforgiving. Crowded households were not merely signs of failure, they were also survival systems built from kinship. This was especially clear in communities where multi-generational living had never disappeared as fully as it had in white middle-class suburban culture. Many Latino, Asian American, immigrant, black and working-class families already had traditions of extended households, shared rent, and mutual aid. For some, taking in relatives after foreclosure fit within existing expectations, though the recession still added pressure. For others, especially those who had built identity around the single-family ideal, moving back under one roof felt like falling backward. The same arrangement could mean different things depending on culture, class, and family history. What looked like failure in one household might look like normal responsibility in another. In the suburbs built during the housing boom, doubled-up living sometimes clashed with the physical design of the neighbourhood. These houses had been marketed as private spaces for nuclear families, with bedrooms assigned to parents and children, garages for cars and storage, yards for play, and homeowner association rules meant to preserve a certain appearance. After the crash, some of those homes held far more people than they had been designed to hold. Driveways filled with cars, garages became bedrooms or storage for relatives' belongings. Trash increased. Neighbours sometimes complained. Cities and homeowners associations had rules about occupancy, parking and property appearance. A household trying to survive could find itself treated as a nuisance because survival made the neighbourhood look less orderly. Renters doubled up too, often under even tighter limits. An apartment lease might restrict the number of occupants. A family taking in relatives could risk violating the lease, upsetting a landlord, or drawing complaints from neighbours. Overcrowding could be dangerous in poor quality housing, especially where ventilation, heating, plumbing or electrical systems were already strained. But when the alternative was a motel, car or shelter, people accepted risk. Housing law and household need did not always match. Families learned to keep quiet, manage noise and avoid attention. The sleeping arrangements in these homes tell much of the story. Mattresses on floors, children in sleeping bags. A grandmother's sewing room turned into a nursery. A basement with space heaters. A dining room with curtains hung for privacy. A converted garage that was cold in winter and hot in summer. A teenage boy on the couch, waking whenever the first adult walked in for coffee. Parents sharing a room with children because there was nowhere else. A baby's crib squeezed beside boxes. These arrangements were temporary in intention, but temporary has a way of stretching. A few weeks could become a school year. A school year could become 2. During this time, families often developed rituals to preserve dignity. They made beds each morning even if the bed was a couch. They stacked bins neatly. They created corners that belonged to children. They used room dividers, curtains, shelves, or taped lines of privacy. They cooked Sunday dinners. They celebrated birthdays in crowded rooms. They put up holiday decorations even when most of their belongings remained in storage. They took photographs carefully, framing the shot so the mattress on the floor or the boxes along the wall did not show. These were not lies. They were efforts to keep the family story from being defined entirely by loss. Food became both a comfort and a source of tension. Shared meals could make the household feel united. A big pot of spaghetti, beans, rice, soup, chili or stew could feed many people cheaply. Family recipes returned. Grandmothers cooked dishes adults had not eaten since childhood. Children might remember this period through food as much as through fear. But food also revealed inequality inside the house. Who bought the meat? Who drank the last milk? Who used food stamps, and did everyone know? Was the displaced family contributing enough? Did the host family hide certain groceries for themselves? These questions could seem petty from the outside. Inside a crowded house, they were part of survival. Work schedules made everything more complicated. Adults took jobs where they could find them, sometimes far from the house, sometimes at odd hours. One person leaving at 5 in the morning woke others sleeping in common areas. A night shift worker slept during the day while children played. Someone needed the car when someone else had an interview. Gas money became a shared concern. Childcare had to be arranged around the rhythms of multiple adults. The house functioned like a small, stressed institution, with transportation, food service, sleeping quarters, finance, conflict mediation, and childcare all happening under one roof. The emotional weight of being a guest did not disappear with time. In fact, it sometimes grew heavier. At first, everyone understood the emergency. Later, when the emergency became normal, patience thinned. The displaced family might feel pressure to show progress. Any purchase could be judged. A fast food meal, a toy, a new pair of shoes, a haircut, Even a small treat could raise silent questions. If you can buy that, why can you not move out? The person being helped might begin to hide purchases or avoid spending anything visible. Poverty and instability make even small pleasures morally complicated because other people may feel entitled to measure them. There were families who grew closer. It's important to say that plainly. Some households discovered strength in living together. Grandchildren formed deep bonds with grandparents. Adult siblings repaired relationships. Parents who had been isolated in suburban life found relief in shared meals and shared childcare. People learned to pool resources and depend on one another without shame. The crisis forced arrangements that some families later remembered with affection, even if they would not have chosen them. Human beings are adaptable, and crowded houses can contain love as well as conflict. But many families were also counting the days. They searched rental listings. They checked credit reports. They called landlords willing to work with damaged credit. They saved tax refunds. They tried to rebuild enough income to leave. This goal shaped the household. Moving out became a measure of recovery. The host family might hope for it quietly. The displaced family might long for it constantly. But leaving required money up front. First month's rent, last month's rent, security deposit, application fees, utility deposits, moving costs, furniture. If the old furniture had been sold or lost, a family could be earning a gain and still be unable to gather enough to re-enter independent housing. The distance between survival and stability was often measured in deposits. Credit damage from foreclosure made this harder. Landlords could reject applicants. Utility companies could require deposits. Car loans, insurance rates, and employment background checks could be affected in different ways. The family had lost the house, but the consequences followed them into the search for the next place. This is one of the ways a housing crisis extends beyond the visible event. The foreclosure may end legally on a certain date, but its record lives in forms, reports, applications, and denials. Some families responded by moving far away. If the local economy was bad, if housing was too expensive, if shame was too heavy, if relatives in another state offered space, they left the community altogether. This meant children changed schools, parents changed job markets, and families cut ties with neighbourhoods where they had expected to remain. The 2008 crisis created small migrations within the country. People moved from expensive suburbs to cheaper towns, from boom states to relatives elsewhere, from ownership to rental markets, from Sunbelt subdivisions to older family homes in the Midwest or South. These moves were not always recorded as crisis migration, but at the family level they were exactly that. The house that took people in changed too. A grandmother's home full of grandchildren became noisier and more alive, but also more expensive. A sibling's apartment became crowded but less lonely. A parent's house became a place where adult failure and family loyalty sat at the same table. No one in the household was untouched. Even the person who kept the house did not keep the old life unchanged. Helping is not passive. It costs space, money, patience, and privacy. In the history of the housing crash, these host households deserve attention because they absorbed part of the national disaster without appearing on bank balance sheets or government rescue plans. At night, when everyone finally settled, the crowded home had its own sound. Someone turning on a couch, a baby fussing, a refrigerator opening late, a television low in another room, pipes knocking after showers, whispered conversations behind a closed door. The house held more breathing than before. For the family that had moved in, sleep could bring relief or discomfort. Relief because they were inside, because the children were not in a car, because there was a roof and a lock and people nearby. Discomfort because the roof was someone else's, because gratitude had limits, because the next day would require another round of job searches, phone calls, school rides, careful spending, and quiet apologies. The American ideal of independence did not disappear in these homes, but it had to make room for dependence. That was one of the hidden lessons of the crisis. People who had believed they were self-sufficient learned how much survival depends on others. Family networks became a private welfare system. They were imperfect, unequal, emotional, and sometimes unfair, but they kept many people from falling further. A spare room could do what a policy had not done quickly enough. A couch could hold someone while the labour market recovered. A shared kitchen could stretch food money. A grandmother's address could keep a child enrolled in school. Still, living together was not the same as recovering. It was a bridge, and bridges are not places people are meant to live forever. Under the same roof, families began the slow work of rebuilding from the smallest units of daily life. A few dollars saved, a job application sent, a meal cooked cheaply enough to feed 9 people, a child kept in school, a tank of gas made to last until Friday, a utility bill split 3 ways, a bag of groceries from a church pantry added to what was already in the cupboard. Survival became less dramatic and more repetitive. It became a set of calculations performed every day by people who were trying to move from emergency to ordinary life without enough money, enough space, or enough certainty. That quiet arithmetic is where the story goes next, because after the door opened and relatives made room, after couches and basements and shared kitchens became temporary homes, families still had to find ways to live. Not in a broad, inspirational sense, but in the direct practical sense of making food, transportation, school, work, hygiene, medicine, bills, and hope last longer than the money did. The strange thing about surviving after losing a home is that the economy becomes smaller and more exact. Not the national economy, not the one measured by unemployment rates, bank failures, interest rates, and speeches from officials standing behind podiums. The economy that matters inside a displaced family is the one written on the back of an envelope, on a notepad beside the phone, in the margins of a church bulletin, or in a mother's head while she stands in a grocery aisle doing math with one hand on the cart. It is the economy of gas in the tank, milk in the refrigerator, minutes left on the phone, quarters for laundry, school lunch money, prescriptions, bus fare, diapers, and the small amount of cash that must somehow make it to Friday. After the 2008 crisis, many Americans who lost homes did not fall into a single dramatic moment of complete destitution. They entered a long period of calculation. That calculation was quiet because much of it happened inside households, inside cars, inside grocery stores, inside relatives' kitchens, inside motel rooms, and at kitchen tables where people tried not to let children see the numbers. Families survived by building systems no one praised. They stretched food. They delayed payments. They shared rides. They borrowed $20. They sold things. They learned which church gave groceries on which day. They learned which bills could be late without immediate disaster, and which ones could not. They learned that survival was not one decision. It was 100 small decisions repeated until the crisis loosened, or the person making them grew too tired to continue. The first rule of this quiet economy was that everything had to be ranked. In a stable household, bills may arrive with different levels of annoyance, but most are paid within the ordinary rhythm of income. After foreclosure or job loss, that rhythm broke. Families had to decide what mattered first: food, gas, medicine, phone, car insurance, storage unit, childcare, utilities, minimum payments, rent to a relative, motel fees, school costs. Every choice had consequences. Pay the phone bill and the family could keep receiving calls from employers, schools, landlords and agencies. Miss the phone bill and a job lead might vanish. Pay the storage unit and the family kept the beds, photographs and documents that were supposed to be used again one day. Miss the storage bill and the belongings saved from the house might be auctioned. Put gas in the car and someone could get to work. Do not put gas in the car and the job itself could be at risk. This kind of ranking changed the meaning of money. $10 could be dinner, gas, a prescription copay, laundry, or part of a school field trip fee. $20 could decide whether a parent went to an interview or stayed home. $50 could keep a phone working. $100 could buy a week of groceries if stretched carefully, or disappear into a motel payment before anyone felt it. People who had once thought in monthly mortgage payments now thought in smaller units. A gallon of gas, a carton of eggs, a load of laundry, a bus pass, a bag of diapers, a meal large enough to produce leftovers. The economy of survival was measured in increments too small for national headlines, but large enough to shape every hour of the day. Food was often the first place where families tried to save money, because food spending could be adjusted more easily than rent, insurance, or debt. This did not mean food was unimportant. It meant it was flexible in a way other expenses were not. Families learned to shop around sales, coupons, discount stores, food pantries, and whatever could be bought cheaply in bulk. Rice, beans, pasta, peanut butter, oats, potatoes, canned tuna, ramen, frozen vegetables, eggs when affordable, ground meat stretched through sauces or casseroles. A meal might be designed less around taste than around how many people it could feed, and whether it would still be edible the next day. Chili, soup, spaghetti, macaroni, casseroles, beans and rice, pancakes for dinner, sandwiches, and anything that could be cooked in a large pot became regular tools. In doubled-up households, food could become both communal and carefully guarded. A large pot on the stove might feed everyone, but individual items could still carry tension. A child might drink juice that belonged to someone else. A teenager might finish leftovers meant for work lunch. A parent might buy groceries with food assistance and feel watched by relatives who were also struggling. People wrote names on containers. They divided shelves. They hid snacks for children. They apologized for eating. They accepted meals from hosts while wondering whether gratitude was enough. Hunger was not always the issue. Often there was food, but it came with negotiation. Food banks and church pantries became part of ordinary life for many families who had never used them before. This shift could be emotionally difficult. A person who had once donated canned goods at a school drive might now stand in line to receive them. The line itself was an education. There were elderly people, single mothers, laid-off workers, people in uniforms, people with children, people who arrived in cars, people who looked like neighbours, people who looked like anyone. The recession widened the face of need. Pantries saw families who did not fit old stereotypes of poverty. They saw homeowners who had become displaced, workers whose hours had been cut, parents who were employed but underpaid, grandparents supporting grandchildren, and people waiting for unemployment benefits to arrive. The food pantry had its own rhythm. Sign in. Provide a name, maybe an address, maybe proof of residence, maybe nothing depending on the place. Wait. Receive bags or boxes. Canned vegetables, soup, pasta, cereal, rice, beans, bread, peanut butter, sometimes meat, sometimes fresh produce, sometimes items close to expiration, sometimes things the children did not like but would have to eat anyway. Volunteers might be kind. Some were brisk. Some knew how to preserve dignity. Others did not. The person receiving food learned to be grateful even when the food did not match the family's needs, even when there were no diapers, no formula, no fresh fruit, no meat, no easy way to cook what had been given. Gratitude was expected, and most people felt it, but gratitude did not remove the stress of making donated food into meals. Government assistance also became part of survival, though not always smoothly. Unemployment benefits, food assistance, school meal programs, WIC for young children, Medicaid in some cases, housing vouchers where available, emergency aid from counties or charities, all of these could help. But applying for assistance required forms, identification, proof of income or loss of income, addresses, waiting periods, interviews, phone calls, and often long lines. People who had never navigated public benefits had to learn quickly. They learned that help could be necessary and difficult at the same time. A person might qualify but wait. A person might need help but earn just slightly too much. A person might be approved for food assistance but still have no stable kitchen. A policy that looks generous on paper can feel thin when measured against rent, gas, childcare, and the cost of being poor. There was shame around these programs, and that shame did real damage. Some people delayed applying because they did not want to be seen as the kind of person who needed help. That phrase, the kind of person, carried an entire cultural judgment. Many Americans had been taught to divide the world into people who worked and people who received assistance, as if the two groups did not overlap. The Great Recession made that division harder to maintain. People who had worked for years found themselves applying for unemployment. Parents who had owned homes applied for food stamps. Families who once paid property taxes asked schools about free lunch. The crisis revealed that need is not a permanent identity. It can arrive after a layoff, a medical bill, a mortgage reset, a collapsed housing market, or one bad month that becomes 3. Cash work filled the gaps. Babysitting, cleaning houses, repairing cars, painting, yard work, hauling scrap, selling baked goods, cutting hair, tutoring, pet sitting, day labour, helping someone move, fixing appliances, doing nails at a kitchen table, taking shifts off the books, selling items online, collecting cans, driving someone for gas money. Some of this work had always existed. After the housing crash, it became more important for families trying to survive damaged credit and unstable employment. The formal economy was weak. The informal economy, the one built through neighbours, relatives, friends, church contacts, and local ads, became a way to produce money quickly. This work was often invisible in official accounts. A woman cleaning 2 houses for cash while staying in her sister's spare room might not appear in labour statistics in any meaningful way. A man fixing brakes in a driveway on weekends might be unemployed on paper and working in reality. A teenager, babysitting cousins after school so adults could take shifts, was contributing economically, even if no one called it employment. Survival blurred the line between work and family duty. People did what could be done, often without benefits, security, or predictable pay. Transportation shaped nearly every choice. In much of America, especially the suburbs and exurbs where the housing boom had been intense, a car was not optional. Jobs, schools, grocery stores, clinics, and relatives could be miles apart. Losing a home did not make those distances shorter. If a family still had a car, they protected it fiercely. Car insurance, registration, repairs, tyres, oil changes, and gas became survival expenses. A broken car could destroy a job search or cause a worker to lose employment. A repossessed car could turn a housing crisis into a deeper collapse. Families sometimes kept paying for a car while other bills fell behind because without the car there was no path to income. Gas money became a daily calculation. Could the parent drive children to the old school and still get to work? Could they visit the food pantry and still have enough gas for Monday? Was the cheaper grocery store worth the extra miles? Should someone attend an appointment across town if the benefit was uncertain? People combined errands with precision. Grocery store, pharmacy, school, job application, library, pantry, laundromat, all in one route if possible. In households with one working car and several adults, transportation required scheduling like a business operation. Whoever controlled the car often controlled opportunity. The library deserves attention again because it functioned as one of the most important public shelters that did not call itself a shelter. It was warm in winter, cool in summer, open to anyone who behaved quietly, and filled with computers. People looked for work, printed resumes, checked email, applied for benefits, researched foreclosure, searched rentals, and gave children a place to do homework. A family might spend hours there because it cost nothing and did not require buying coffee or food. Children could read. Adults could sit without being asked why they were there. The public library was one of the few places in a market-driven society where a displaced person could exist for a while without immediately paying. Cell phones and prepaid plans became another line in the survival budget. A phone kept a person connected to employers, schools, landlords, relatives, agencies, banks, shelters, and possible side work. But phone service cost money. Families with damaged credit or unstable income used prepaid phones, limited minutes, shared phones, and careful texting. Running out of minutes could mean missing a call about a job or apartment. Charging the phone required access to electricity. In motels, libraries, cars, workplaces, and relatives' homes, outlets became small lifelines. People watched battery percentages the way they watched gas gauges. Debt collectors formed part of the background noise of this period. Credit cards, medical bills, unpaid utilities, deficiency balances, car loans, personal loans, payday loans, and old mortgage-related debts could follow families after the house was gone. The phone rang. Letters arrived at relatives' houses. Some people stopped answering unknown numbers. Others answered and tried to negotiate. Some felt harassed. Some felt ashamed. Debt collection made recovery harder because it kept the past active. A family trying to assemble grocery money might also be told that an old account demanded payment immediately. The legal and financial system did not wait for emotional recovery. Payday lenders, pawn shops, rent-to-own stores, check cashing places and title loan businesses became more visible in the lives of many struggling families. These businesses offered quick access to cash or goods, often at high cost. A person might pawn a tool, a ring, a gaming console, or a musical instrument to cover a bill intending to reclaim it later. Sometimes they did, sometimes they could not. A payday loan might solve an immediate problem and create a larger one 2 weeks later. A rent-to-own appliance might seem necessary when a family finally moved into an apartment without enough money to furnish it. These choices are easy to criticise from a distance. Up close, they were often made when every better option had already failed or taken too long. The quiet economy also depended on barter. Not always formal barter, but exchange. I will watch your kids if you drive me to work. I will fix your sink if you help me move. I will cook dinner if you buy the groceries. I will give you my old furniture if you can haul it away. I know a landlord who might rent you if you mention my name. I can store your boxes for a month. I can lend you my address. These exchanges kept families functioning. They also created obligations. Help received often had to be returned later, and people remembered who helped and who did not. In a crisis, social trust becomes an economic asset. Women often carried much of the management of this small economy. Not always, but often enough that it needs to be said. They tracked food, school forms, appointments, benefits, children's clothing, relatives' patients, and the emotional needs of the household. They knew which child needed shoes, which bill could wait, which pantry had diapers, which cousin could babysit, which teacher needed a call, which medicine was running low, and how much gas remained. This was unpaid work, but without it, families would have fallen apart faster. The crisis created an enormous amount of administrative labour inside homes, and much of it was done by women sitting at tables, in parked cars, or on hold with agencies. Men carried other pressures, especially when identity had been tied to wages, mortgage payments, and being able to provide. Some took any work available. Construction workers hit by the housing collapse might move into lower-paid service work, warehouse jobs, delivery, security, maintenance, or day labour. Some searched for months. Some hid the depth of their discouragement. Some became angry, withdrawn, or restless because the public story of masculinity had not prepared them to be dependent. A man who had built houses during the boom might, after the crash, be unable to keep his own family housed. That irony was not academic. It could sit with him every night. Children participated in the economy too, even when adults tried to shield them. They learned not to ask for field trip money too late. They accepted cheaper shoes, they ate free school meals, they saved snacks. Older siblings watched younger ones. Teenagers took part-time jobs and handed over some earnings for groceries or gas. Some children became excellent at reading prices because they went shopping with parents who calculated every item. Others became secretive about the family situation. refusing invitations that cost money, avoiding birthday parties because gifts were required, or pretending they were not hungry because they knew the refrigerator was thin. The crisis taught children economic behaviour before they had words for it. Schools became part of survival in ways beyond education. Free and reduced price lunches mattered. Breakfast programs mattered. Teachers sometimes kept snacks in drawers. Counsellors connected families to clothing drives, holiday gift programs, housing resources and food assistance. School nurses noticed untreated medical needs. Bus routes mattered because transportation shaped attendance. For displaced children, school could provide meals, warmth, routine, adults who cared, and a place where life still followed a schedule. When families fought to keep children in the same school after losing a home, they were not being sentimental. They were protecting a support system. Thrift stores and charity shops became supply lines. Clothes, shoes, coats, dishes, small appliances, bedding, furniture, books, toys and household goods could be bought cheaply. For families who had sold or lost belongings, thrift stores helped rebuild a household. They also carried emotional complexity. A parent who once bought new school clothes might now search used racks for the right size. Children might not care, or they might care deeply if classmates noticed. Adults learned which stores had better prices, which days new items came out, which churches held clothing closets, which community groups gave backpacks before school started. The second-hand economy became part of the rebuilding process. The internet changed survival in ways earlier generations of displaced families had not experienced. People searched job boards, applied online, sold possessions, found rooms for rent, joined forums, read advice, and looked for aid. But online systems also created barriers. Applications required email addresses, scanned documents, passwords, and reliable access. A family without home internet relied on libraries, phones, or borrowed computers. A person under stress had to remember login information and upload documents while worrying about where to sleep. Modern poverty was not technologically simple. It required digital competence under unstable conditions. Medical care often became delayed. People without insurance, or with insurance tied to jobs that had been lost, put off appointments, dental care, prescriptions, and follow-up visits. A toothache became something to endure. Glasses waited. Chronic conditions were managed imperfectly. Parents prioritised children's care over their own. Mental health needs, already strained by housing loss, often went untreated. Stress showed up in headaches, stomach problems, sleeplessness, high blood pressure, depression, anxiety, and arguments. The economy of survival saved money in the short term by postponing care, but the body kept the account. Holidays were difficult. The holiday season after a foreclosure could feel especially cruel because American holidays are tied so strongly to home. Thanksgiving tables, Christmas trees, lights on houses, family gatherings, gifts hidden in closets, stockings, special meals, guests arriving, children waking in their own rooms. A displaced family had to recreate these rituals in borrowed or temporary space. Parents bought smaller gifts, used charity programs, wrapped donated toys, cooked in someone else's kitchen, or skipped decorations because most were in storage. Some children were grateful for anything, some were sad. Adults often worked hard to make the day feel normal, and then felt the absence more sharply after the children slept. The recession also changed how people thought about pride. Pride had once meant paying your own way, not needing help, owning a home, keeping up appearances. After losing a house, some families had to build a different kind of pride around endurance, responsibility, and accepting help without disappearing into shame. That took time. There is no easy dignity in standing in a food line the first time. There is no easy dignity in asking a relative for gas money. But dignity can develop through repetition. People learned that needing help did not erase their work, their intelligence, their past, or their worth. Some learned this gently from others. Some learned it angrily because they had no choice. Neighbours and informal community networks mattered. A neighbour who had not lost a house might still give rides, pass along job leads, offer leftover groceries, or take a child to school. Former neighbours sometimes remained connected even after a family moved. Churches, parent groups, union contacts, veterans groups, immigrant associations and local non-profits formed webs of small assistance. These webs were uneven. Some people had strong networks, others had almost none. That difference could determine whether a family slept in a spare room or in a car, whether a child stayed in school, whether a parent heard about a job, whether a storage bill was covered, whether a pet could be kept. Survival was partly about money, but it was also about who answered the phone. There was a hard moral accounting inside many displaced adults. They replayed decisions. Should we have bought the house? Should we have refinanced? Should we have sold earlier? Should we have taken the loan modification? Should we have moved sooner? Should we have asked for help before everything fell apart? These questions did not pay bills, but they occupied the mind. The quiet economy of survival included regret, and regret consumed energy. People who looked functional from the outside might be spending hours each week mentally reliving the path to foreclosure. Shame is expensive in its own way. It uses attention that survival also requires. Some families found stability through a single turning point: a job offer, a tax refund, a relative's loan, a landlord willing to take a chance, a government benefit finally approved, a debt settled, a car repaired, a child accepted into a school program with transportation. Other families did not have one turning point. They improved by inches, one bill caught up, 1 month without moving, one regular paycheck, one bedroom that belonged to the children again, one drawer unpacked. The move from crisis to stability was often so gradual that people did not notice it until later. One day they realised the phone did not ring with collectors as often. The pantry had enough food for the week. The rent was paid. The children knew where their shoes were. No one was sleeping on a couch unless they chose to. Still, the habits of survival remained. People who had been through foreclosure often continued to keep extra food, avoid debt, distrust lenders, save cash in small amounts, watch bills closely, and think carefully before buying anything large. Some never again felt fully safe in housing. Even after recovery, a late notice, a job rumour, or an unexpected bill could bring back the old fear. This is part of the long history of economic crisis. It changes behaviour after the numbers improve. The Great Depression shaped how many families saved string, reused jars, avoided banks, and feared waste for decades. The 2008 crisis shaped a generation's relationship with debt, home ownership, credit, and risk in ways still visible years later. The quiet economy of survival was not pretty, but it was intelligent. It required planning, memory, discipline, negotiation, improvisation, and emotional control. It required people to know prices, schedules, resources, personalities, bus routes, school policies, benefit rules, family tensions, and the hidden cost of every choice. It was not the kind of intelligence celebrated in boardrooms where the crisis had been packaged and sold in complex financial language. It was another kind of intelligence, built in grocery aisles, laundromats, public libraries, borrowed kitchens, and cars running low on gas. By the time a family had lived this way for months, the children had absorbed more than adults wanted them to. They had learned which foods were cheap. They had learned when not to ask. They had learned that addresses could change, that adults could be frightened, that a house could disappear from your life while still standing somewhere with your memories inside it. They had also learned who helped. They learned which relatives opened doors, which teachers noticed, which friends stayed kind, which strangers looked away, and which ordinary routines could keep a person steady when almost everything else moved. For the adults, survival was often counted in bills paid and nights sheltered. For children, it was counted differently, in embarrassment avoided, friendships preserved, pets lost or kept, schools changed or not changed, and the slow discovery that home might mean something other than the building they had left. Children rarely learn the whole story at once. That is one of the first things to understand about the 2008 housing crisis when we look at it from inside a family rather than from the outside. Adults often tried to give children the truth in pieces, partly because they wanted to protect them, and partly because the adults themselves did not know what the truth would become. A parent could say, "We may have to move," before knowing where. A parent could say, "We are staying with Grandma for a while," without knowing whether a while meant 2 weeks or a year. A parent could say, "The bank is working with us," even while beginning to suspect that the bank was not really working with them at all. Children heard these sentences and accepted some of them, questioned others, and filled the gaps with their own private explanations. The younger ones might not understand foreclosure, but they understood absence. They understood that their toys were in boxes, that the dog was gone, that the old house was no longer a place they could run through freely, that a parent's face changed when certain mail arrived, that someone cried in the bathroom with the water running. They understood the motel room was not a vacation because no one seemed happy. They understood that sleeping on a couch at an aunt's house was not the same as a sleepover, because the adults did not laugh enough. They understood that everyone was trying to make something feel normal, and that the effort itself meant things were not normal. Older children understood more, and sometimes that was harder. They heard the words foreclosure, credit, bank, lawyer, unemployment, modification, and auction. They searched online. They listened behind doors. They read papers left on tables. Some asked direct questions and received careful answers. Others stopped asking because the answers made adults sad or angry. A teenager might know almost exactly what had happened and still pretend not to, because pretending allowed the family to preserve a little dignity. In many homes after 2008, children became keepers of family secrets. They knew enough to be afraid, and enough not to talk about it. School became one of the main places where shame appeared. Not always in dramatic ways. Shame often entered through small administrative details. A form asking for a current address, a bus route that no longer made sense, a teacher asking why a child had been absent, a classmate asking why they were being dropped off from a different car, a birthday invitation that required giving directions to a home the child did not want anyone to see, a school project about my house or my room that suddenly felt dangerous. Schools run on paperwork and routine, and housing loss interrupts both. A child without a stable address could feel exposed by the simplest questions. Some children tried to hide the move. They gave the old address as long as they could. They said the family was staying with relatives because repairs were being done. They told friends the motel was temporary, which was true but not enough of the truth. They avoided inviting anyone over. They stopped asking to go to friends' houses because a return invitation would be expected. Teenagers especially learned to manage appearances. They kept clothes clean even when laundry was difficult. They avoided talking about where they slept. They laughed off questions. They became skilled at changing the subject. They learned that social life requires a stable background, and when the background disappears, even friendship can become complicated. Children can be kind, but they can also be precise in their cruelty. A classmate who learned someone was living in a motel might repeat it. A child who wore the same clothes too often might be teased. A student receiving free lunch might feel watched, even if many others received it too. After the housing crash, schools in many communities saw more students whose families were doubled up, displaced, or moving between temporary arrangements. But a child experiencing it could still feel alone. Statistics do not protect a child from embarrassment in a hallway. Teachers and school staff often became quiet witnesses. They saw children arrive tired, hungry, anxious, or distracted. They saw homework missing because there had been no quiet place to do it. They saw permission slips unsigned because papers had been lost between bags, boxes, and cars. They saw children who had once been steady become irritable or withdrawn. Some schools had homeless liaisons under federal law. People responsible for helping students without stable housing remain enrolled, receive transportation and access services. These supports mattered. They could keep a child in the same school after a family lost a home. They could arrange meals, supplies, and transportation. But help at school depended on the family being willing to disclose the situation, and disclosure was often the hardest step. A parent might hesitate before telling the school. They worried that the family would be judged. They worried that someone might think the children were unsafe. They worried that admitting homelessness could bring attention from agencies or gossip from other parents. They worried because losing a house had already made them feel as if their competence was on trial. So some families stayed silent until a school counsellor noticed. Others told only one trusted teacher. Others used the law and the available help with no shame because they understood the children needed stability more than the adults needed privacy. There was no single way to handle it. Every choice carried risk. For children, the loss of a bedroom could be one of the most concrete losses. A bedroom is not only a place to sleep, it is where a child arranges the world in miniature. Posters, toys, books, clothes, hidden objects, drawings, collections, trophies, blankets, notes from friends, a lamp, a nightstand, a spot on the wall. Losing a bedroom meant losing the one place where the child could close a door and have some control. In a motel, a doubled-up house, or a car, that control disappeared. A child might own a backpack, a plastic bin, or a corner of a room, but not a space. That difference mattered. Privacy is not a luxury for children. It is part of how they learn who they are. The loss of pets left its own mark. Many families facing foreclosure surrendered dogs and cats because the next place would not allow them. Adults often understood the practical reasons. Children understood the absence. A pet is part of a child's map of home. The dog that greeted them after school, the cat on the windowsill, the animal sleeping at the foot of the bed during storms. Losing the house and the pet together could make the crisis feel complete. Parents sometimes said the pet was going to stay somewhere else for a little while, and sometimes that was true. Sometimes it became permanent. Children remembered both the explanation and the fact that the animal did not return. The 2008 crisis also changed children's relationship to objects. Some became anxious about losing things. They guarded toys, bags, and keepsakes. They wanted to know where each box was. They asked about items in storage. Others detached from objects because attachment had become painful. They learned not to care too much about furniture, decorations, or rooms, because those things could be taken away. This was not always visible to adults in the moment. A child who stopped asking for possessions might look mature. Sometimes maturity was simply a form of self-protection. Teenagers often carried an additional burden because they could understand the family's social position. They knew what foreclosure meant in a neighbourhood. They knew when parents were ashamed. They knew when a car was almost out of gas. They knew when the refrigerator was thin. Some took part-time jobs and used the money for school activities, clothes, food, or even household bills. Some became caregivers for younger siblings while parents worked, searched for work, or sat on the phone with lenders and agencies. Some became angry at the lost house, at the bank, at parents, at themselves, at friends who still lived normally. Teenage anger during a housing crisis was sometimes grief with nowhere respectful to go. There were children who changed schools once, twice or more. Each move could mean new teachers, new rules, new bus routes, new lunchrooms, new groups of friends already formed before the displaced child arrived. A child who had been confident in one school might become quiet in another. A teenager who had been known as an athlete, musician, or strong student might become the new kid with no history. School changes are common in American life, but forced moves carry a different weight because the child did not choose them, and the parent could not always soften them. Leaving a school meant losing not only education, but witnesses. Friends who knew the old version of the child remained behind. For many families, keeping children in the same school became the centre of survival. Adults drove long distances from motels, relatives' homes, or cheaper apartments so children could keep teachers, friends, and routines. This could require gas money the family barely had. It could require waking children early. It could require explaining to employers why a schedule was difficult. But parents did it because continuity mattered. A child who had lost a bedroom, a pet, a neighbourhood, and a sense of security might still have a desk in the same classroom. That desk could become a small form of home. The emotional life of parents during this period often revolved around protecting children from shame while feeling shame themselves. A parent might feel they had failed because the children no longer had the house they had been promised. Even when the foreclosure was caused by a job loss, medical bills, predatory lending, falling home values, or broader economic collapse, many parents still turned the failure inward. They remembered telling children which room would be theirs. They remembered backyard birthdays, school bus mornings, holiday decorations, and the pride of unlocking the door for the first time. Losing the house felt, to many, like breaking a promise. But children did not always see it that way. Some children were frightened, yes. Some were embarrassed. Some were angry. But many were more focused on whether adults remained emotionally present. Did someone tuck them in, even on a borrowed mattress? Did someone keep dinner predictable? Did someone explain enough without making them feel responsible? Did someone show up at school? Did someone remember the favourite blanket? The crisis taught many families that children needed stability, but stability was not identical to ownership. A rented room could feel safer than a house full of fear. A grandmother's crowded kitchen could feel more secure than a foreclosed home where parents whispered every night. A motel could feel less frightening if adults kept routines and told the truth carefully. This is where the meaning of home began to change for many families. Before the crisis, home had often meant the house itself. The mortgage, the yard, the school district, the paint colours, the furniture, the address. After the crisis, home became more practical and more fragile. It became the place where the family could sleep without being asked to leave that night. The place where the children knew where their shoes were. The place where a parent could cook something warm. The place where mail could arrive and not be lost. The place where a child could put a drawing on a wall and expect it to stay there for a while. Home became less about ownership and more about predictability. This shift had deep historical roots. Americans have often defined home through property because land and ownership have been central to the nation's self-image from the beginning. The colonial farm, the frontier homestead, the post-war suburban house, the starter home, the retirement home, all of these carried the idea that owning a place made a person more secure and more complete. But American history is also full of people who made home without ownership. Enslaved families created domestic life in quarters they could not legally own, and from which they could be sold away. Immigrant families built homes in rented tenements. Migrant workers made temporary camps function as family spaces. Depression-era families doubled up, moved, and rebuilt routines wherever work could be found. Renters, boarders, lodgers, and displaced people had always made home under conditions of uncertainty. The 2008 crisis did not invent that experience. It brought it into the lives of many people who had believed ownership had placed them beyond it. For children, this older truth became personal. Home was no longer guaranteed by a deed or mortgage. It was created through repeated acts. Breakfast, a ride to school, a bedtime routine, a backpack kept ready, a parent showing up, a safe adult, a place to store a favourite object. Some families became very intentional about these routines after losing a house. They ate dinner together even in a motel room. They kept bedtime consistent even in a crowded relative's home. They created small corners for children's belongings. They celebrated birthdays in whatever place they had. They took photographs. They marked growth on paper instead of a doorframe because the doorframe was gone. These acts may look small, but they were the labour of rebuilding home without owning one. There was also shame around the word renter. This may sound strange because renting is normal for millions of people, but for families who had been taught that ownership was the sign of progress, returning to renting after foreclosure could feel like a demotion. Children picked up on that. Adults might say, "It is just an apartment," or "We're only renting for now." The word only did a lot of damage. It told children the current place was less real. Some families later learned to stop saying it. A rented apartment could be a good home. A small duplex could be a good home. A trailer, a room, or a shared house could be the place where a family recovered. The crisis forced many people to separate the idea of home from the status of ownership, and that separation was painful, but sometimes freeing. The shame did not only come from outside, it lived in comparisons. Children compared their lives to friends who had not moved. Parents compared themselves to neighbours who had kept houses. A child might visit a friend's home and feel the difference sharply. Their own room, their own bed, snacks in the pantry, family photos still on walls, a dog still in the yard. These visits could produce envy, sadness, or embarrassment. Adults experienced their own version when they drove through old neighbourhoods or past houses that looked like the one they lost. The crisis made ordinary stability visible. A house with lights on and a family inside became something not everyone could assume. Holidays, school events, and birthdays often intensified the shame. A child might not want classmates to know the birthday party would be at a relative's crowded apartment, or not happen at all. A parent might skip a school fundraiser because money was tight and the conversations felt unbearable. A teenager might avoid homecoming or sports fees because asking would strain the family. When money becomes scarce, the social life of children narrows. Activities that once seemed normal become expensive. Uniforms, instruments, club dues, field trips, yearbooks, birthday gifts, gas to attend events. Parents tried to say yes when they could, but every yes had to be funded from somewhere. Some children responded by becoming careful. They checked prices before asking. They said they did not want things they actually wanted. They noticed when parents looked tired and changed the subject. Adults often praise this as maturity, and sometimes it was. But there is a sadness in a child becoming careful too early. Childhood is supposed to include some protected foolishness, some asking without calculating, some belief that adults will handle the numbers. The housing crisis pulled many children closer to the arithmetic of adult life. At the same time, children also saw generosity. They saw a teacher quietly provide supplies. They saw grandparents make space. They saw neighbours bring food. They saw churches give holiday gifts. They saw parents keep going when they were tired. They saw friends who did not make fun of them. They saw siblings share beds and blankets. These memories mattered too. A crisis can teach fear, but it can also teach what help looks like. Many children who lived through the foreclosure years learned early that survival is not individual. Someone opens a door. Someone gives a ride. Someone prints a form. Someone watches a child. Someone lends a mattress. Someone says, "Stay here tonight." The problem is that children often learn this alongside mistrust. They learned that banks could send letters that changed everything. They learned that adults could sign papers and still not be safe. They learned that work did not always protect a family. They learned that the house could look normal from outside while falling apart financially inside. As they became adults, some carried caution into their own financial lives. They were wary of mortgages. They delayed buying homes. They rented longer. They avoided debt when possible or used it reluctantly. Some felt determined to own because they wanted to regain what had been lost. Others felt determined not to tie safety to a bank again. The children of the crisis did not all respond the same way, but many absorbed the lesson that housing is never just housing. It is power, risk, status, memory, and vulnerability at once. For parents, the shame could soften over time, especially when they saw children adapt. A child who made friends in the new school, a teenager who graduated despite the disruption, a younger child who began calling the apartment home. These moments did not erase the loss, but they challenged the idea that the family had failed completely. The house was gone, but the family was still functioning. Dinner still happened, homework still happened, illness was handled. Birthdays came, children grew. A parent who had once believed the house was the proof of love might slowly learn that love had survived without the house. There were families who eventually spoke openly about what happened. Years later, at a table in a rented home or a newly purchased smaller house, parents told the full story. They explained the mortgage, the job loss, the letters, the move, the relatives, the motel, the fear. Adult children sometimes understood more kindly than parents expected. Some had known already. Some remembered details parents had hoped they would forget. The smell of boxes, the argument in the kitchen, the night in the car, the couch at grandma's, the teacher who helped, the friend who mocked them, the pet they lost, the first apartment afterward. The shame had not hidden as much as adults thought. This is one of the hardest truths about children and crisis. They remember, not always accurately in a factual sense, but deeply in a sensory one. They remember the room, the tone, the feeling of being told to pack, the particular sadness of a parent trying to sound cheerful. They remember where they slept. They remember being cold or crowded or embarrassed. They remember kindness. They remember silence. And because they remember, the history of the 2008 crisis lives not only in foreclosure records and bank reports, but in the adult lives of people who were children when their homes were lost. By the time a family began to stabilise, the word home might have become smaller, but also more honest. It no longer meant a guaranteed American promise. It meant a place held together by money, yes, but also by care, routine, paperwork, luck, and help. It meant something that could be lost and remade. It meant a child could sleep without listening for whispered arguments. It meant the backpack stayed in one place. It meant the parent knew which bill was due and had a plan to pay it. It meant there was a working key, a working stove, a place for mail, and enough confidence to buy groceries for more than a day or two at a time. That changed meaning did not come easily. It came after shame had done its work, after families had lived in rooms too small for them, after children had learned too much, after adults had apologised for needing help, after everyone had discovered that the old definition of home had been too dependent on ownership and not dependent enough on safety. Once that realisation settled, the final part of the story became less about the day the family left and more about what remained afterward. The credit damage, the altered dreams, the habits of caution, the family memories, and the question of whether a house once lost can ever truly be left behind. The keys did not stop looking like keys after they stopped opening anything. That was one of the stranger details many people carried with them. A brass house key, a garage remote, a small ring of copies made for parents, teenagers, neighbours or dog walkers, all of it could remain in a purse, a drawer, a glove compartment, or a box of old papers long after the house belonged to someone else. In legal terms, the transfer might have been clear. The foreclosure sale happened, the deed changed, the bank took possession. A new buyer eventually appeared. The locks were changed, the property moved on. But objects do not follow legal timelines neatly. A key can remain in someone's hand after the right to use it has ended, and that small useless weight can hold more memory than a stack of court papers. For families who lost homes during the 2008 crisis, leaving was not the end of the story. It was the end of one kind of pressure and the beginning of another. The house was gone, but the consequences travelled. Credit reports carried the foreclosure for years. Rental applications asked about past evictions, foreclosures, income and debt. Utility companies could require deposits. Car loans became harder or more expensive. Some employers checked credit in certain hiring processes. Insurance costs could be affected. A family might no longer have a mortgage payment, but the record of that mortgage followed them into the next stage of life. The loss was not finished when the keys were handed over. It became part of the paperwork by which institutions measured the family later. This is one of the reasons the phrase walking away was often misleading. People did use it at the time. Some homeowners did walk away from houses worth far less than the mortgage attached to them, especially when they had no realistic way to recover. Some made that decision deliberately. Others were forced out by job loss, payment resets, illness, divorce, or months of failed negotiations, but very few people simply walked away in the emotional sense. They carried the house with them in debts, credit damage, memories, habits, and altered expectations. The door closed behind them, but the experience entered the way they made decisions. A foreclosure on a credit report could last 7 years. 7 years is a long time in a household. A child can move from elementary school to high school in that time. A marriage can end or rebuild. A worker can retrain. A family can move 3 times. A baby can become a second grader. For 7 years, the old house could appear in financial records whenever someone tried to rent, borrow, insure, or rebuild. It meant the crisis was not a single event, but a long shadow. Even families who stabilised could find themselves reminded of the foreclosure whenever they tried to take the next step. The first rental after foreclosure often came with compromise. A landlord willing to accept damaged credit might require a larger deposit, a co-signer, proof of steady income, or several months of rent in advance. Some families moved into older apartments, smaller houses, less desirable neighbourhoods, or areas farther from work and school because that was what they could qualify for. Others found landlords through personal connections, relatives, churches, or co-workers. A person's reputation in the community sometimes mattered more than the number on a credit report. That could help if the family had strong networks. It could leave others stranded if they did not. The first night in a new rental could feel like relief, but not the same relief as buying a first home once had. The family might have a door again, a kitchen again, bedrooms again, a mailbox again. But the confidence was different. People who had lost a house often moved in carefully, emotionally and physically. They did not always unpack everything right away. Some kept boxes sealed because part of them expected another move. Some avoided painting walls or hanging too many pictures. Some watched every bill with a seriousness that had not been there before. A stable address returned, but trust returned more slowly. Furniture told the story of recovery. A family that had sold or lost much of what it owned had to rebuild a household piece by piece. A mattress first, then a table, then chairs, a couch from a thrift store, dishes from relatives, a dresser found online, a television bought second-hand, lamps, curtains, towels, sheets, a microwave, a vacuum, a bookshelf. The objects of ordinary life came back slowly, and because they came back slowly, they were noticed. In a house before the crisis, a chair might simply be a chair. Afterward, a chair meant someone no longer had to sit on a box. A kitchen table meant meals could happen in one place again. A child's bed meant the child was not sleeping on a couch or floor. Recovery was measured in furniture as much as in money. The old storage unit, if it had survived, became a place of reckoning. When families finally had space again, they opened boxes packed during panic and discovered what had been saved. Some items seemed essential when packed and pointless later. Others brought unexpected emotion. Children's drawings, holiday ornaments, tools, baby clothes, the good dishes, photographs, school papers, a lamp from the old living room. Sometimes families found that mice, moisture, heat, or time had damaged what they stored. Sometimes they found they no longer wanted the furniture that had cost so much to keep. This was another quiet loss. Paying to preserve a former life did not always mean that former life could be restored. For people who lost storage units, the absence could last for years. They might remember a particular photograph, a quilt, a childhood keepsake, or a box of records and realize there was no way to retrieve it. The official history of foreclosure rarely includes these secondary losses, but families remember them. A house is not the only thing lost when housing collapses. The systems around a house also fail. Storage, mail, routines, school continuity, pets, friendships, documents, and family objects all become vulnerable. Neighbourhoods carried their own afterlife of the crisis. In many communities, foreclosed houses sat vacant for months or years. Lawns grew high. pools turned green, windows were boarded, notices were taped to doors, copper pipes were stolen, vandals entered, animals nested. A single empty house could lower the value and morale of a whole street. Several empty houses changed the feeling of the neighbourhood entirely. Children lost playmates. Homeowners who remained watched their own property values fall. Some felt trapped because they could not sell without taking a loss. Streets built during the housing boom, once advertised as places of arrival, began to look unfinished or abandoned. In some areas, investors bought foreclosed houses in large numbers and turned them into rentals. This changed the housing landscape in ways that continued long after the immediate crash. Houses that had been sold to families as ownership dreams became assets in rental portfolios. Some were maintained well, others were not. The shift contributed to the growth of single-family rentals, especially in hard-hit markets. A family might rent a house very much like the one it had lost, perhaps even in a subdivision where many houses had changed hands through foreclosure. Ownership had moved upward into institutions and investors, while former homeowners returned as tenants. That reversal is one of the important historical consequences of the crisis. For many families, the dream of owning again did not disappear, but it changed. Some wanted it desperately. They wanted to repair credit, save money, qualify for another mortgage, and prove that the foreclosure had not defined them. Years later, some did buy again, often more cautiously, choosing smaller homes, fixed-rate loans, larger down payments, or cheaper locations. They read every document more carefully. They asked more questions. They distrusted easy promises. Their second attempt at ownership had less innocence in it. It was not only a dream, it was a risk to be managed. Others wanted nothing to do with owning again. They became renters by caution, as much as by necessity. A lease could feel safer than a mortgage because it did not carry the same sense of personal ruin if things went wrong. Repairs were someone else's responsibility. Moving was easier. Debt was smaller. A renter could still lose housing, of course, and many renters faced instability of their own. But for people burned by foreclosure, the mortgage had lost its aura of safety. The house had been a dream, then a debt, then a document, then a loss. Renting could feel like an honest arrangement by comparison. The crisis also changed how people talked to their children about money. Families that had once avoided discussing finances sometimes became more direct. Children learned about bills, credit, interest rates, savings, emergency funds, and debt, because the adults did not want them to be surprised later. Some parents warned children against borrowing too much. Some urged them to buy property only when truly ready. Some told them never to trust a lender who made a payment sound easy. Some taught them to keep cash aside, avoid adjustable loans, read documents, and understand that a house is not guaranteed to rise in value. These lessons were sometimes useful, sometimes heavy. Children raised inside crisis can inherit caution along with wisdom. The emotional residue was harder to name. A person could be stable again and still feel panic when opening mail. A late bill could produce a reaction out of proportion to the amount owed. A letter from a bank could bring back the kitchen table, the foreclosure notice, the phone calls, the hold music, the paperwork, the humiliation. A person might keep every document in careful folders for years because losing control once made disorganization feel dangerous. Another might avoid financial paperwork entirely because the memory was too stressful. Crisis creates habits in both directions. Some people become meticulous, others become avoidant. Both responses can come from the same wound. Relationships with relatives change too. Families who had been taken in did not always return to the old balance after moving out. Gratitude remained, but so did memory. A parent might remember which adult child helped and which did not. Siblings might remember who paid for groceries, who complained, who watched the children, who made the displaced family feel welcome, who made them feel small. Help can strengthen family ties, but it can also create debts that are not financial and not easily repaid. Years later, A holiday dinner might still carry the memory of those crowded months. No one mentions it, but everyone remembers who slept where. Some marriages survived because the crisis forced honesty and teamwork. Others ended after the house was lost or during the long process of losing it. Financial stress is one of the most severe tests a household can face. The foreclosure exposed secrets, spending habits, resentments, unequal labour, unrealistic expectations, and different attitudes toward risk. A couple might disagree about whether to fight the bank, file bankruptcy, move in with relatives, sell possessions, or leave the state. If the marriage was already strained, the crisis could make repair impossible. If the marriage was strong or became stronger under pressure, the shared survival could become part of the family's identity. We got through that. People said this years later, and the word that carried more than outsiders could hear. The crisis also changed bodies. Stress is not only emotional. People gained weight, lost weight, developed insomnia, delayed medical care, drank more, smoked more, argued more, worked more, and rested less. High blood pressure, anxiety, depression, stomach problems, headaches, and chronic pain often accompanied financial collapse. Parents who were trying to shield children sometimes ignored their own health until the emergency had passed, and by then the body had recorded the damage. The official end of a recession does not tell you when a person's sleep returns to normal. Some people felt anger long after the house was gone, anger at banks, anger at mortgage brokers, anger at employers, anger at politicians, anger at themselves, anger at neighbours who judged, anger at relatives who helped badly or not at all. Anger at a system that rescued large financial institutions faster than it rescued families. That anger was not always organised into politics. Sometimes it remained private and bitter. Sometimes it became distrust of institutions. Sometimes it shaped voting, community involvement, or refusal to take on debt again. The 2008 crisis was not only an economic event, it was a trust event. Many people learned that the systems they had been told were solid could fail, and then explain the failure in language that did not include them. At the national level, the economy eventually recovered in many of the ways economists measure recovery. Markets rose, banks stabilised, home prices in many areas climbed again, unemployment fell, new construction resumed. But recovery from the top down did not match recovery from the household out. A family that lost equity in 2008 could not always participate when prices rose later. A person whose credit was damaged might miss the chance to buy at lower prices. A neighbourhood that lost owner-occupants might not regain the same social fabric. A child whose schooling was disrupted did not get those years back. Economic recovery can restore numbers without restoring time. There was also the question of wealth. Home ownership had long been one of the main ways American families built wealth, especially those without access to large inheritances or high incomes. Losing a home often meant losing years of savings, down payments, improvements, and hoped-for equity. For Black and Latino families, who were disproportionately affected by high-cost loans and foreclosure in many areas, the crisis deepened existing wealth gaps that had been built through decades of discrimination in housing and lending. This was not only a personal tragedy repeated many times, it was a historical event that shifted wealth, opportunity, and security across communities. The houses themselves continued without the families who had loved them. This is a hard fact. A house can hold one family's most painful memory and still become another family's fresh start. The room where one child cried over a move might later become another child's bedroom. The kitchen table may be gone, but another table arrives. Walls are painted, carpet is replaced, locks change. A bank-owned property becomes a listing becomes a sale becomes a home again. This does not erase what happened. It shows how buildings move through human lives without belonging fully to any one story. Some former owners drove past their old houses. Not everyone did. Some avoided the neighbourhood completely because seeing the house was too painful. Others drove by once just to know. They saw new curtains, a different car in the driveway, a change paint colour, a fence repaired, a tree cut down, a child's bicycle where their own child's bicycle had once been. The house looked familiar and not familiar. That can be unsettling. A person may discover that life has continued perfectly well in a place that still feels partly theirs. The world does not pause around private loss. Children who grew up and return to old neighbourhoods sometimes experience this differently from parents. To them, the old house might be a childhood landmark rather than a financial wound. They remembered the bedroom, the yard, the walk to school, the move, the embarrassment, and perhaps the relief of later stability. Some carried resentment, some carried understanding, some barely remembered. In families that spoke openly, the old house became a story. In families that did not, it became a silence with an address attached. What remained after the keys were gone was not only damage, that matters too. Many families rebuilt. They rented good homes. They bought smaller homes. They repaired credit. They changed careers. They paid off debt. They learned to cook cheaply and never stopped. They kept emergency funds. They became more careful, more sceptical, more willing to ask questions. Some found that the loss stripped away a certain pressure to appear successful. After the house was gone, keeping up appearances mattered less because the worst had already been visible. This did not make the foreclosure good. It means human beings often make some kind of use from what hurt them, because otherwise the hurt has the last word. There were children from foreclosure families who became adults with deep respect for stability. They signed leases carefully. They saved money. They helped parents. They chose jobs for benefits, not only passion. They became social workers, teachers, organisers, financial counsellors, lawyers, renters, homeowners, cautious borrowers, or people who kept cash hidden in envelopes. Some avoided risk. Some took risks because they had already seen security fail. Their lives cannot be reduced to the crisis, but the crisis entered their sense of what adulthood required. For the parents, memory often settled around particular scenes. The first notice, the yard sale, the storage unit, the motel, the relative's couch. The day a child asked if they were poor. The final walk through the house, the key left behind. The first night in a new place. The first time they paid rent on time after months of instability. The first grocery trip when the cart did not have to be calculated quite so tightly. Recovery was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was the return of small freedoms, buying a week of groceries without fear, letting a child invite a friend over, hanging pictures, ordering a pizza, sleeping through the night, opening mail without panic. The 2008 housing crisis is often remembered through its largest images: Wall Street firms, collapsing banks, government bailouts, angry hearings, falling markets, and rows of empty houses. Those images are real. But they are incomplete. The history is also in ordinary rooms where people made lists, packed boxes, slept badly, asked for help, and learned to live with less space. It is in the school counsellor who helped a child stay enrolled. It is in the grandmother who turned a sewing room into a bedroom. It is in the father who drove to work from a motel parking lot. It is in the mother who stretched one pantry box into 5 dinners. It is in the teenager who never told friends where the family was sleeping. It is in the useless key kept for years because throwing it away felt like losing the house twice. A home can be lost in a legal act, but the meaning of that home leaves more slowly. It leaves in pieces. The address stops being used. The furniture is sold or replaced. The children stop asking when they can go back. The old commute fades. New routines form. New neighbours learn your name. The old key disappears into a drawer or trash can. Then, years later, something brings it back. A smell of cardboard, a bank envelope, a certain kind of kitchen light late at night, a child, now grown, asking what really happened. Memory is not foreclosure law. It does not close on schedule, and maybe that is why this history is worth telling in this slower way. The crisis was not only a failure of markets, It was a failure that entered bedrooms, classrooms, kitchens, cars, and family relationships. It forced Americans to discover how much of life rests on housing and how quickly that foundation can crack. It revealed the limits of the old promise that owning a home would make a family secure. It showed that people can do what they were told, work hard, sign papers, make payments, raise children, keep lawns trimmed, and still be caught in forces larger than their own decisions. It also showed how much survival depends on the small, unrecorded acts of other people. By the time the worst years passed, millions of families had learned a new definition of home. Not the slogan version, not the commercial version with sunlight through clean windows and a smiling family carrying boxes into a perfect empty room. A more practical definition. Home was the place where you could set down your bag and expect it to be there tomorrow. The place where children knew where to sleep. The place where mail could find you. The place where the food in the refrigerator belonged to the household and not to a temporary arrangement. The place where the adults could argue about ordinary things again instead of survival. The place where the key worked and kept working, and no one had to wonder when it would stop. If any part of this story stayed with you tonight, I would like to know which part. Maybe it was the foreclosure letter on the kitchen table. Maybe it was the storage unit, the motel room, the child trying to keep the family secret at school, or the key that no longer opened anything. Leave a comment if you want to share that moment, or if your family lived through something like this and there is a detail people never seem to understand. These ordinary details matter. They are where history keeps its human shape. And if you have stayed with me through this whole story, thank you. Truly. Stories like this are not always easy because they are close enough for many people to remember. They do not have the distance of centuries. They sit near us, in old credit records, in family memories, in neighbourhoods where the houses still stand. Take care of the people in your house tonight, whatever kind of house it is. Turn the key if you have one. Notice the room you are in. Notice the small things that make it yours. A chair, a cup, a light, a sleeping child, a pet at the door, a stack of mail, a floor that holds you without asking a question. These are ordinary things until history reminds us that ordinary things are never guaranteed. I will see you in the next one. Until then, keep a little patience for the people around you. You never know what table they once sat at, what letter they once opened, or what key they still carry.